record in the Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Blazier, people represented by Mr. Goldberg and Mr. Darden. Mr. Blazier.
Good morning, Your Honor. I had one other exhibit that I got last night that is a couple of excerpts from the California Association of Criminalists Code of Ethics that I may use this morning, and I provided the court with actually my only copy, so I told Mr. Goldberg about it, but he has not seen the copy. Also, we did not deal with knife number 118 yesterday. I think we all forgot about it. We need to deal with that this morning.
I'm sorry.
118, the knife that was ordered produced.
Okay. Do we have those reports?
I thought Ms. Clark either had them or gave them to the court.
No reports.
I have them all here, Your Honor. I thought she'd give them to you as well.
Your Honor, is it permissible for us to handle this issue when Ms. Clark is here, since she was addressing the court on it previously?
Your Honor, I'm going to be getting into this relatively quickly. Ms. Clark said she was going to provide you with the reports. Mr. Goldberg knows what's in the reports. It's not terribly complicated.
All right. Do we have the item here?
Your Honor, yes, we do. Your Honor, as the court recalls, the people did ask permission to reopen, which the court said you would consider in the event that the court were going to allow us to get into this issue. So I just wanted to remind the court of that, because if that were the case, then perhaps.
All right. This is 118, item 118 here.
Yes.
Yes, it is. All right. Unfortunately, Mr. Blazier, the reports that were just submitted to me appear to be 12, 15 pages.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I haven't had the opportunity to read them at this point, so until I have that opportunity and hear from the counsel, we won't get to that.
Well, then I would ask that we wait. That's part of my cross-examination, and I'm going to get to it probably within an hour or so.
Well, then why don't we proceed for an hour, and then when we get there, maybe we'll be at an appropriate time to break, and I'll be able to read the reports. All right? Any other comment?
No.
All right. Let's have the yours.
Your Honor, may we have that copy back of, or at least have extra copies made so Mr. Goldberg can review it?
Oh, sure. I thought you had provided copies to Mr. Goldberg. All right. Maybe I get one of the law clerks to make me a copy of these items. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Mr. Matheson, would you please resume the witness stand, please? Mr. Matheson is undergoing cross-examination by Mr. Blazier. Good morning, Mr. Matheson.
Good morning.
You're reminded, sir, you are still under oath, and Mr. Blazier, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Matheson, good morning.
Good morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Mr. Matheson, I'd like to ask you some questions about Mr. Simpson's reference blood sample. That's item number 17, correct?
Yes, it is.
And that had originally been logged in as item number 18, and the number was changed on it,
It
correct?
states the evidence is full long, and
Sustain, rephrase the
It had
question.
originally been recorded by Mr. Fung and Ms. Mazzola as item number 18, and that number was changed, correct?
That's correct. At some point, it was believed to be 18, and then it was corrected.
Would you agree that the suspect's reference sample in a criminal case is an extremely important piece of evidence?
Yes, it is.
And could you use the analogy that with a wheel, all items of evidence are compared to that, correct?
To that and other reference samples, yes.
And that reference sample, in effect, is the hub of the wheel from which everything else is looked at, correct?
Along with other references, yes.
And if the integrity of that reference sample is compromised in some fashion, then that would affect the validity of the analysis of other things that are compared to it. Would you agree with that?
argumentative.
Overruled.
Yes, if there is some problem that compromises the validity of it, then there is a concern, yes.
And would you agree that with respect to blood samples, many tests can be run on extremely small amounts of blood samples?
That's correct.
And would you agree that by virtue of that, that very small amounts of blood could be used, hypothetically, to contaminate large numbers of items of evidence?
Vague, overbroad.
Overruled.
I'm not sure what you mean by very small and large quantities. You could well, if the samples come in direct contact with each other, sure, there could be transfer and contamination.
And we talked about yesterday that as small as 1 or 2 nanograms, 1 or 2 billionths of a gram of blood can be tested, and you can get results using DNA testing, correct?
Misstates testimony.
Overruled.
That very small quantities, yes, can be detected and tested.
Now, would you also agree that blood, in a sense, is anonymous in that by just looking at it, you can't tell where it came from, can you?
No, you cannot.
And by the same token, a swatch that has what appears to be blood on it, just by looking at that, you can't tell anything about where that came from, can you?
That's correct.
Now, when blood is drawn from a suspect, it is done in a hospital setting, is it not, generally, or a medical setting?
Irrelevant.
Overruled.
In a medical setting, yes.
The detectives don't do that in their office, do they?
No, not normally.
It's done by a trained person who knows how to draw blood, correct?
It's my understanding, yes.
Now, have you drawn blood before yourself? Do you know how to do that?
No, I don't.
Have you seen it done?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the techniques that are used to draw blood?
Only on those that have been used on me.
Are you familiar with the technique where a syringe is used to take blood out of a vein, and then the syringe is injected into a vacutainer?
I've heard about it. I've never seen it done.
And the vacutainer, or the tubes that we've been talking about, you were showing a couple of them yesterday, or the other day, you recall those?
Yes, I do.
And they are manufactured with a vacuum inside. That's why they're called vacuum tubes, correct?
That's correct.
So that when a needle is stuck into a vacutainer, it tends to suck in whatever might be in the syringe, correct?
Well, as far as... Well, there is a vacuum. It's going to try and draw in whatever is stuck into it if there's a needle with an opening in it.
And do you know how much blood would be drawn in, given the amount of vacuum in a vacutainer, how much blood would be drawn in just on its own coming in from a syringe? In other words, nobody's pushing on the end of the syringe. Do you have any idea?
No foundation for the
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Do you have any idea how much blood would be drawn into a vacutainer, given the amount of vacuum that is in those containers, if you just stuck a syringe with blood in it in the top without pushing the plunger down?
It's a complete hypothetical and no foundation.
Foundation, sustain.
Have you ever done any experiments on trying to determine how much blood goes into a vacuum tube because of the vacuum in that tube?
No, I have not.
Can I have an exhibit, Mark?
Mrs. Robertson. $11.35. And Mr. Blazer, what is this?
This is a vacutainer that contains some cranberry juice.
All right.
Mr. Matheson, let me show you this exhibit, which is 1135.
11.35.
Yeah, I showed you that, I believe, yesterday, did I not?
Yes, you did.
And I gave you a measuring device so that you could verify how much cranberry juice was in that vial, did I not?
Yes.
And we verified that there are approximately 8 milliliters in that vial, correct?
But when I poured it off and measured it, I measured 7.5.
And we noticed that there was some still in the bottom of the tube, correct?
That's correct.
So there is 7.5 plus what was in the bottom of the tube in that vacutainer, correct?
Correct.
Now, you described that, I believe, the other day as a 10 milliliter tube, didn't you?
That was a assumption I had, yes.
It actually holds, if the cap is off, a lot more than 10 milliliters, doesn't it?
Yes.
It holds approximately 14.
I don't know. I would want to measure it.
Okay. And when you were estimating on the stand 2 days ago, I believe, how much blood would be half of the vial, you measured from the top of the cap to the bottom of the vial, did you not? I think you put your finger on the top and your thumb on the bottom, or maybe the other way around.
Actually, not to the top of the cap, but to the top of the glass part of the tube.
Now, 8 milliliters of blood in that tube would essentially look very much like that, would it not?
Well, the fact that I measured it yesterday, yes.
Now, is blood heavier or lighter than water?
Blood is slightly heavier.
You know about how much?
Not very much
Not
at
very
all.
much.
There is a slight difference, though.
Do you know how much that vial weighs?
No, I don't.
It weighs very little, doesn't it?
That's vague.
Can you estimate the weight of that vial?
Not just by feeling it, no.
Is it important that blood samples, such as a suspect's reference sample, be transported carefully?
Vegas, carefully.
Overruled.
Well, you want to transport anything carefully, particularly if you're dealing with a biological sample, so you don't spill it.
You don't want to break it either, do you?
No.
And is it appropriate for one criminalist to put a sample of blood in a trash bag and give it to another criminalist to transport without telling that criminalist what it is?
Argumentative calls for conclusion.
Overruled.
I don't think it's inappropriate, no.
You would recommend that that's okay to put that in a trash bag, give it to somebody, don't tell them that it's in there, to let them carry it around?
Argumentative, asked and answered.
Overruled.
Well, if I would be concerned if just a vial was dropped into a trash bag or something and then handed to it, but the fact that it is in other packaging and there's a little bit of padding there, I don't think it's wrong in doing that.
How about taking that trash bag and leaving it on a counter or on a table overnight without telling anybody that it's in there? Would you recommend doing that?
It's not a great procedure, no.
And you have janitors at SID, correct?
Yes, we do.
Now, I want to go through the records that are maintained at the lab with respect to all records that you have of withdrawals from Mr. Simpson's reference tube. Do you have that in mind?
Yes, I believe so.
Now, I want you to assume, for purposes of a hypothetical, that you started with 8 milliliters of blood, approximately. You have that in mind?
Okay.
Now, your records indicate, do they not, that on September 14th, criminalist Colin Yamauchi withdrew approximately 1 milliliter of Mr. Simpson's reference blood.
I remember that reference, yes.
And do you need to look at the record to make sure of that?
Yeah, it would be good, yes.
Okay. Let me show you a serology item description note.
Okay.
And that's consistent with what you said, is it not?
Yes, it is approximately 1 milliliter.
Now, on June 20th, blood was withdrawn for purposes of doing toxicological analysis, correct?
I don't know the exact date. I'd like to see a record of that, too.
Sure.
Please.
Let me show you a toxicology document.
Okay.
And that indicates that as of that date, there was 5.5 milliliters, correct?
Objection, no foundation for business records. Here's set.
Sustained.
You recognize that document as a regular form that's used in your toxicology unit?
It looks familiar, yes.
And those are filled out in the regular course of business of the people that work in the toxicology unit?
I believe so, yes.
And do you know who filled that out?
Well, looking at the initials, that is not one of my units, and I have not worked with this person, but the initials are consistent with Elisa Flaherty.
And are those are filled out during the normal course of conducting an analysis, correct?
It's my understanding, yes.
And they're filled out, I'm sorry, were you done?
Yes.
And those are filled out at the time that the testing is done, correct?
I said it's my understanding, yes.
And does that appear to be,
No foundation.
and that indicates that as of the 20th, there were 5.5 milliliters in that reference sample, correct?
That's what the form indicates.
Now on some point around June 27th, Mr. Yamauchi withdrew some sample from the reference tube for purposes of doing electrophoretic analysis, correct?
Okay, I'd like to see the record. I believe he did a notation of having removed some portion of the blood on the 25th.
Okay,
of June.
let me show you a record. And what is a thread, by the way?
A thread is a small portion of cloth.
Just like it sounds.
Yes.
And when you use the term a thread in the context of electrophoretic analysis, what does that mean?
Well, thread is used, you put the sample on it, whether it's extracted from another item or a whole blood sample, let it absorb onto this thread that's approximately a centimeter, a little over a quarter-inch long, and that's what's placed in that gel that was shown a few days ago.
Now, I want you to take a look at that document I gave you and see if that refreshes your memory about some of that reference sample being removed on the 27th.
Seems that's not an evidence of a pattern.
Ooh. Yes, this does indicate that on June 27th, some threads were prepared for electrophoresis.
I'm sorry. And that's your note
Yes, that's in my writing.
of your observation of that thread being removed.
Oh, threads, yes.
Now, approximately how much blood is necessary to make a thread?
Oh, I've never measured it, but the quantity of blood to actually make the threads is quite small. Matter of fact, it may even be less than the amount of blood that's left in the pipetter that we use to withdraw the blood.
Okay. Now, on the 25th, the records indicate that there was another withdrawal from the reference sample, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And let me, would having a record of that help refresh your memory?
Yes, it would.
Still states Beck's not, I mean, assumes Beck's not an evidence that he had in that one.
Sustained. Sustained. Sustained.
Do you have a recollection of blood being withdrawn approximately the 25th for certain types of analysis?
I was not present at that time, but I was made aware of it.
And you've reviewed the records about that, have you not?
Yes, I have.
And you remember what's in the records, don't you? Or do you?
Not everything, no.
Would it help refresh your memory to see the records?
Yes, it would.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Now, does that document appear to be a form document that's used in your laboratory?
Yes, it is.
And are those filled out at the time that the actions described in the document are taken?
At or about that time, yes.
And does that appear to be filled out in the appropriate manner?
Yes, it does.
And do you recognize the handwriting?
Yes.
Whose handwriting is it?
The majority of it on the page is Mr. Yamauchi's.
What does that document indicate with respect to the removal of blood from Mr. Simpson's reference sample at that time?
No foundation.
Overruled.
It indicates that on June 25th, there was approximately 3/4 of a milliliter removed.
And that was for what purpose?
For, I believe, ABO typing and some initial electrophoresis work.
Now, is there any indication on that record about an additional amount being withdrawn for toxicology?
Well, it doesn't reference it being removed for toxicology.
What is that reference?
That refers to the quantity of blood that's present in a microcentrifuge tube that was with the blood vial.
Now, microcentrifuge tube, that's a little tiny tube that has a kind of almost a pointed bottom, correct?
It's a plastic tube, correct, that has kind of a conical shaped bottom with a snap cap on the top or a screw top cap.
And that holds about 1.5 milliliters.
Yes.
Now, that record indicates that as of the date that Mr. Yamauchi withdrew 3/4 of a milliliter for serological purposes, that there was a microcentrifuge tube there with the reference vial, correct?
That was packaged with it. Yes, that's correct.
And you're familiar with that little microcentrifuge tube, are you not?
Yes, I am.
You've seen it, and you've measured it, haven't you?
Yes.
And how much blood is in that microcentrifuge tube now?
At this moment?
Yes.
I don't know.
How much was in it when you measured it?
I would have to reference one of my notes.
Sure.
Trying to locate the date in which one of those determinations was made.
You need straight edge.
No, thank you. Okay, I have a reference from September 21st that gives a total measurement for the blood vial and the microcentrifuge tube. I did not delineate how much was in each.
And that indicates what?
On September 21st, 1994, that there was approximately 3.8 milliliters total of blood.
Now, you recall in January of this year that you measured as precisely as you could the amount of Mr. Simpson's blood that was left.
I would want to confirm that.
Why don't you check your records?
I have a reference in my chronology that a request is made by Deputy Goldberg to determine the quantity of the blood present. I did not record on that chronology what that amount was.
What did you determine the total amount to be?
At that point, I don't have notes on it. I believe I just telephonically advised him.
Done.
On January 4th, 1995.
I have two pictures I'd like to have, Mark.
1136. Do you want to do A and B, or 1136 and 1137?
36A and B.
All right.
Show you a photograph, 1136A. Does that appear to be the blood tube, the reference sample of Mr. Simpson with the microcentrifuge tube?
Yes, it does.
And let me show you 1136B. Does that appear to be another picture of the same thing from a slightly different angle?
Yes, it does.
And could I display these on the Elmo?
Yes.
I think 1136A works.
All right, Mr. Blazier.
Now, Mr. Matheson, that's the photograph you identified as Mr. Simpson's reference sample, correct?
Yes.
And that little tube at the bottom is the microcentrifuge tube that we were talking about?
Appears to be, yes.
And that was a 1.5 milliliter tube. That's the capacity of that little one, isn't it, Mr. Harris?
We need to see the bottom of that.
There we go.
Yes, that's a standard quantity for those tubes.
And what does the business record indicate was remaining in that microcentrifuge tube as of approximately June 25th?
According to Mr. Yamauchi, he put approximately 3/4 mLs or milliliters.
And that indicates that that microcentrifuge tube, that was the blood withdrawn for the toxicological analysis, doesn't it?
As to what indicates?
The business record that you have in front of you.
It does not specifically say that's what it was for in this record, no.
Would you agree that there is a number, 1477, associated with that entry?
Yes, there is.
And what does that stand for? Do you know?
I believe it's a reference number in toxicology.
So, and that's a number that's assigned to a sample of blood when it's sent for toxicology, correct?
I don't know the inner workings of their unit, but it's a number that appears on the tube.
And is that the ID number of the technician that does the work generally?
I don't know that, no.
$11.37.
11:37.
Matheson, let me show you 1137. That appears to be another photograph of the vial.
Yes, it is.
And do you see initials on there, on that vial? WF.
I see initials. It's not WF.
What is it?
I believe it's LMF.
And LMF is who?
I believe that's Lisa Flaherty.
And she's the person that does toxicology, correct?
She works in that unit, yes.
And is there a number next to her initials?
Yes, there is.
What's that number?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's her serial number. I don't believe it
Oh, no,
is.
I'm sorry. I meant what, tell us what the numbers are.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's,
Check that there's no foundation for the photograph when it was taken. Also discovery.
Sustained.
Your Honor, on the latter objection, could I be
Sustained. Sustained.
Mr. Matheson, do you recall, I believe in January, when I visited the lab along with Mr. Taylor and Mr. Scheck?
I know you were there, yes.
Let me show you 1136B again. You remember us taking photographs and measurements of the reference tube?
Yes, I do.
I object on the same grounds, foundation and discovery.
Overruled.
Recognize your hand in that picture?
I'm not sure if that's my hand. I do remember manipulating the vial.
Okay. Is there any doubt in your mind that that's Mr. Simpson's reference blood vial?
No, there's not.
Okay. Now, I'd like you to look at the purple top on that vial.
I still object on discovery grounds.
All right, let me see counsel at the sidebar.
show you.
Hold on.
Okay.
Got to let the court reporter sit down and. All right.
Let me again show you 1136A. And I want you to look at the top of that vial between the purple top cap and the glass. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
And do you agree that there appears to be blood smeared on the purple top cap in that position?
There does appear to be small quantities of blood in the cap, yes.
Now, when you withdraw blood from a reference tube such as that, you don't pour it out, do you?
No,
You take a pipetter and put it in the blood, take the blood up into the pipetter, and then take it out, correct?
correct.
And the proper procedure is to do that, presumably without spilling the blood all over the vial, correct?
Of course, you try and be as careful as possible.
And that's the standard procedure that's used anytime a trained person like yourself removes blood from a vial like that, correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, the Elmo doesn't portray this very well. May I actually have the jurors view these pictures?
Yes. And if you just hand them, as soon as you finish looking at them, hand them to the next juror so we can speed this up just slightly. All right, Mr. Blazier, would you collect those items from Deputy Smith, please?
Now, Mr. Matheson, I think you testified that from your measurements, there was 3.8 milliliters as of what date? Totally remaining blood?
I believe that was September 21st. Yes, on September 21st, approximately 3.8 milliliters.
And that included the blood in the microcentrifuge tube, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Now, on September 30th, a sample of that blood was released to the defense, correct?
I'll confirm that in my notes.
Let me show you a record.
Yes, that's correct. Approximately 1 milliliter was released.
And those are your notes made in the regular course of your work, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And when you released that 1 milliliter to the defense, you used a graduated pipette, did you not?
I used a automatic pipetter that draws up 1 milliliter.
So you can determine 1 milliliter from using that pipette fairly precisely, can't you?
Yes.
Now, when you measured the amount of blood left in January, that was around the time of our visit to the lab, my visit and Mr. Taylor's and Mr. Scheck's, correct?
Approximately, yes.
And you provided us with the total measurement of Mr. Simpson's reference sample at that time, did you not?
I believe I did. I seem to remember making a copy of something.
And I want you to assume hypothetically that there was 2.8 milliliters of blood left at that time. You have that hypothetical in mind?
Improper hypothetical.
Overruled.
Your Honor, I'd like to use another exhibit at this time.
Not at this point.
May we approach?
No. We've already had our discussion with this. Proceed.
Between the taking of that reference sample on June 13th and the time that you measured it in early January, are there any other records, business records of your agency or the Los Angeles Police Department of withdrawals from that reference sample?
There are no records that I can recall, in addition to the ones that we've talked about, other than what is implied by the testing that I did, and I did not specifically record that I'd withdrawn a certain amount.
So that you're aware of no other withdrawals from the business records from that blood other than the one you just alluded to?
As I'm sitting here right now, I would, to be absolutely positive, I would like to go through all of the pages and notes that were between that time frame.
But you reviewed all the notes in preparation for your testimony, haven't you?
I've reviewed many notes, yes. It's quite voluminous.
And you've known for quite some time that the issue of how much blood was taken out of that tube has been an important issue, haven't you?
Vague, argumentative.
Overruled.
Yes, I've been aware of the issue.
Your Honor, I would like to use the exhibit.
No. The foundational problem still, counsel, as I indicated to you. You can use it when there's one more piece of the foundation there. Proceed.
May I have a moment, Your Honor? Mr. Matheson, every time something is taken out of that reference tube, initials are put on the tube. Isn't that correct?
Whenever somebody uses that tube in some way as far as testing or removal of a sample, they're supposed to initial it. That's correct.
Let me show you, again, exhibits 1136A and B and 1137, and ask you to tell me each and every initial that's on that blood vial.
Okay, I see one, as mentioned earlier, that was LMF.
And that would be for toxicology, correct?
That's correct. There's what appears to be an initial above that that I don't recognize. I'm not even sure I can read it. Above that on the tube are my initials with the date 6/27/94. And then there, above that appear the initials of Colin Yamauchi of 6/25/94.
Mr. Mattson, let me stop you for a second. And would it help you to look at a record of all of those initials in your handwriting?
Sure.
Oh, God, I think this might be easy. Is that a business record in your handwriting?
Yes, it is.
And that's a recordation by you of all of the entries or initials on that blood vial, correct?
No foundation
Overruled.
under business records exception.
Sustain on the business. Are you going to use the record or using this to refresh his recollection? What are you doing here?
Let me ask you, did you make that particular document in the regular course of your business?
Yes, I did.
And you did that at a time when you were actually looking at the blood vial and the paperwork to determine what was on the blood vial?
Yes,
And you wrote it down as you did it?
that's correct.
Thank you. Your Honor,
No
Could I-
foundation.
You want to mark this as 1138?
yes.
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
Now let me show you 1138, and could you tell us from that record what withdrawals are indicated, or what are all of the withdrawals that are indicated from that record?
Assumes facts not in evidence and briefcase withdrawals.
Overruled.
You could list them in chronological order, please.
There's no information here that says when withdrawals were made. There are initials and there are dates. It doesn't specify what work was necessarily done on each of those times.
All right, let me ask you a question. When someone takes blood out of that for purposes of doing work, they initial it at that time, correct?
That is one of the reasons, yes.
And they write down the date that they do that, don't they?
Normally, it's not required.
But if they wrote down a date, there'd be no reason why they would write a date different from the date they put their initials on there, correct?
Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Is that correct?
They shouldn't, right?
Okay. What are the recordations on that blood vial in terms of people having access to it and taking things out of it?
So I should, because there are references here that are not for when things were taken out.
Okay, well, let's go through all of them and then we'll pare them down.
The ones that I see on this record is the J1477LMF.
And what's the date of that?
There's no date associated with that.
Okay.
GBM 62794.
And that's you.
That's correct. CY for Mr. Yamauchi 62594. And then a 61494 CY. Those are the markings that are on the tube itself, according to my record here.
Now, there are also markings on the envelope that the tube is contained in, correct?
That's correct.
And they also indicate when people initial opening that envelope, correct?
That's some of the information that's here, yes.
And tell us what those entries are.
There is one that is CY 61494, a GBM 93094, followed with the notation for split. Then GBM 1495, followed by the notation to determine quantity.
Is that in your handwriting? I mean, I'm sorry, that's the entry that you made, is it not?
Yes, it is. There is also as far as notations that appear on the envelope, also I have referenced here a note by Fung that says received from Van Adder 61394.
Now, going back to the tube, can I put that on the envelope, please?
Sure.
You focus a little better? Now, Mr. Matheson, incidentally, for the record, the highlighting is mine. I put that there. Mr. Matheson, the first entry for the vial is in terms of dated, is CY on 614. That's Colin Yamauchi, correct?
That's correct, along with the number 18.
And would you agree that that corresponds to the record that you've already identified as Colin Yamauchi's withdrawal on the 14th of approximately 1 milliliter for DNA testing?
Well, I believe that 1 milliliter was for swatching, yes.
For swatching, okay. And would you agree that the entry of CY, Colin Yamauchi, for 625 of 1994 corresponds to the record that you identified where he indicates 3/4 of a milliliter taken for himself and the presence of the microcentrifuge tube with 3/4 of a milliliter?
Calls for speculation, conclusion, opinion.
Overruled.
Well, that entry is no longer visible on the screen, but yes, it corresponds to that time.
And the entry in your initials on the 27th, would you agree that that corresponds to the withdrawal that you made, that you indicated you made no records of?
That I didn't record the quantity that was removed, that's correct.
And did you make any recordation at all about work that you did on the blood that you removed on that date?
There was analytical notes, yes.
Do you have those notes here?
Yes, I do.
Could I take a look at it?
It's associated with the report that was written, completed on 6/28/94. There's one blood analysis summary sheet, a blank or a not form page where I recorded some data along with the serology item description notes, and then some electrophoresis pages that actually cover a couple of different days.
Now, would you agree that that blood analysis worksheet was filled out by Colin Yamauchi, not yourself?
Actually, we both have entries on here.
Okay. So you both did the same work at the same time?
Well, he started some of the work 2 days before on the 25th, and then I was involved and completed some of the work on the 27th and the 28th.
Then the 3/4 of a milliliter he indicated on those records that you're referring to is what was taken out for the work that you and he did during that period of time, correct?
It misstates the evidence because
Sustain. Refer to the question.
Is it correct that the 3/4 of a milliliter entry that you've already testified about around that time, that's the work that you and he did that you just testified to?
still misstates the evidence.
Sustain.
Is there an entry in the records indicating the withdrawal of blood from that vial for the work that you just testified to?
There's an entry of the work that he did, but there is no quantity mentioned for the work that I did.
So are you telling us that you took blood out of that vial to do work and made no entry anywhere of the withdrawal of that blood?
Asked and answered, argumentative.
Overruled.
The fact that blood was removed is implied by the fact that I did work on it and received results from it.
You agree that withdrawals of anything from evidence, when you take something away from a piece of evidence, should be fully documented?
Overbroad.
Overruled.
Not anything and fully documented, no. The fact that results were obtained on an item implies that we removed blood from that item. I described the item that's worked on, and results are obtained from it. There is no reason to make exact notations of the quantity that is used, particularly in a liquid sample from a living individual.
Is there a reason to make any notation?
There is notation in that work was done on it and results were obtained.
Now, I think you indicated that that particular withdrawal was approximately 1 milliliter, correct?
I believe I gave a range that it could have been from 1/2 to 1.
And how much actual blood do you need to use for the testing that you did? It's not very much, is it?
For the ABO test, it would take about, the actual test consumes about 6 drops. The electrophoresis altogether probably doesn't even take a drop, but there are things such as the blood clinging to the sides of the pipettes and that type of thing, and that'd be it.
Okay. Now, so the testing takes, I think, about 6 drops total?
Yeah, probably 6 to 8, somewhere in there.
And there are how many drops in a milliliter approximately?
Approximately 20.
Now, the blood that you didn't use for that particular withdrawal, you put back, didn't you?
Not necessarily.
Do you recall talking to Mr. Regal in about August at the time that he visited the lab about whether you put that blood back or not?
Yes, I do.
Recall telling him that you put the blood back.
I believe I said I thought I did, yes.
And so that if you put the blood back, then all of it would go back into the tube with the exception of the 6 or 8 drops that you used plus what might have clung to the tube.
That's correct.
And have you ever done any kind of test to determine how much would cling to the tube?
No, I have not.
Mr. Matheson, I want you to assume for purposes of a hypothetical that you started with 8 milliliters of blood. Do you have that in mind?
Okay.
I'd like to use the exhibit.
Nope, I still told you have one piece of the foundation that's not there yet.
Yeah, to save some time, may we approach?
Proceed. We've had this discussion, Counsel.
All right, Mr. Matheson, for purposes of this hypothetical, let's assume that 8 milliliters of blood was drawn from Mr. Simpson on the 13th, okay?
Okay.
And the toxicology records indicate that on 6/20, there was 5.5 milliliters left, correct?
No foundation for the hypothetical.
He's testified to the
Assumes
record.
facts, not in evidence.
Overruled.
Okay.
And the only withdrawal from Mr. Simpson's blood between the 13th and the 20th was Mr. Yamauchi's 1 milliliter, correct?
That's correct.
And would you agree that under that hypothetical with those figures, as of the 20th, there is approximately 1.5 milliliters of Mr. Simpson's blood unaccounted for?
Improper hypothetical, Your Honor, argumentative, no foundation.
Approximately, that would be the difference between what toxicology approximated on their date versus what is being told to me in the assumption of starting with 8.
And approximately how many drops are at 1.5 milliliters?
Well, if we assume that there's approximately 20 in 1 milliliter, that would give us about 30 drops.
And 1 drop of blood, depending on the size of the swatch that you use, you can make at least 5 swatches, can you not?
Depending on the size of the swatch, sure.
You could actually make more than 5, correct?
You can make 4 and you can make less, yes, or more.
So that if you use this, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, depending on the size, yes, you could either make more or you can make less.
So that if you used a size swatch that allowed you to make 5 swatches per drop, with 1.5 milliliters of blood, you could make 150 swatches, couldn't you?
Given that hypothetical, yes.
Now, I think you testified on direct that blood that is collected in a vacutainer has a preservative in it called EDTA, correct?
In this particular tube, yes.
And that is a chemical that's put in there to keep the blood from coagulating, correct?
It's my understanding, yes.
And there are procedures that are available to determine whether that particular chemical is present, correct?
No foundation to this witness.
Rephrase the question.
Are you aware of procedures available called gas chromatographic mass spectrometry to determine the presence of that chemical?
I know that GCMS, which is the short version of the instrument you used, does exist, and it's used for identifying different types of chemicals and things. I don't know of any specific procedure. I've never been involved in testing for EDTA, but I would assume it could be done.
Now, hypothetically,
No foundation for any further questions on this line.
Haven't heard the question.
I'm sorry?
Haven't heard the question.
Hypothetically, Mr. Matheson, if blood from this case, from an evidence item such as from the back gate, showed the presence of a chemical, EDTA, would you agree that that is consistent with it possibly coming from a reference file?
That is an improper hypothetical. It's inconsistent with the known facts.
Overruled.
As you stated it, if it was present in it, if it was able to be identified in it, it is possible that it could have come from some type of reference sample that previously contained EDTA. I don't know what the sensitivity limits are of the instrument or exactly how much EDTA is placed into a tube, but given the hypotheticals you stated, it's possible.
And hypothetically, if there was the chemical EDTA found in the blood on the socks, would your answer be the same, that that would indicate that it may have come from a reference file?
Your Honor, improper hypothetical, no facts, no foundation for it.
Overruled.
Argumentative.
We would also have to assume or make the assumption that there's no other source of EDTA that could have gotten on those socks. Then yes, I'd agree.
We could handle that other matter now. I'm getting close to that point.
Well, why don't you finish what you have here? Then we'll take that up at our break.
We respectfully request the court's guidance on the use of an exhibit.
Counsel, we've had this discussion.
Mr. Matheson, do you have any information regarding the amount of blood that was originally drawn from Mr. Simpson?
Calls for hearsay.
Overruled.
No personal knowledge.
Rephrase the question.
Do you have any personal knowledge of, or do you have any information regarding the amount of blood that was drawn from Mr. Simpson?
As phrased, no foundation for personal knowledge.
Overruled.
The only information I have regarding that quantity was what I heard during the preliminary hearing.
And that was from the nurse who drew it, correct?
Well, this calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Do you have any reason to believe that the amount of blood drawn from Mr. Simpson was anything other than 8 milliliters?
Your Honor, that calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Hearsay.
On to the next topic.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a 15-minute recess at this point for the jury. Please remember all my admonitions to you. We'll see you back here in about 15 minutes.
Perpetrator, that's going to be the blood of the victim. So if what Mr. Blazier is saying is that that is indeed a true type B and not a BA, then this knife is completely irrelevant because as we know for sure, none of these victims was a type B. Now, if what Mr. Blazier would like to argue is that this is actually the blood that's a BA type degraded to a B, that's fine. I don't know what he does with his inconsistent argument that the type B found under her fingernails was actually not a BA degraded, but a real B. That becomes internally inconsistent. So their position is revealed by their insistence on this piece of evidence to be both logically and scientifically ridiculous. There's no relevance because it was obviously not there at the relevant time. It was planted there by someone else. We also have a situation in the testing of this item that reveals that there's no PGM obtainable. Obviously, what we have is very degraded blood on this knife. The EAP came back B in one spot, and, excuse me, Your Honor, I'm talking fast because I know you want to get this done, and be inconclusive on the EAP marker. But there was no PGM obtainable from it at all, showing how severely degraded this blood is. So that, all of those factors put together reveal how irrelevant this piece of evidence, quote unquote, really is. I would like for Mr. Matheson to address further the scientific issues if the court would like to hear that concerning the significance of the degradation, the loss of the PGM marker. What is interesting in contrast is that the fingernail scrapings from underneath Ms. Brown's fingernails reveals we do have a PGM type that is consistent with her, which tends to further buttress the fact that the blood type EAP is a degraded BA. But on this knife, we have nothing. All we have is a type EAP that shows a B and a B inconclusive, no PGM activity on the blade of the knife, which would be the blood of the victim. So what does that have to do with this case? At a point in time after the metal detectors have swept the area, it's more nonsense, red herring is what it is. And under 352, it would be unduly misleading, confusing, and time-consuming to this jury to chase down yet another dead end that the defense wants to throw in their face. May I confer one moment, Your Honor? Yes, Mr. Darden points out further that it would take about 5 witnesses to resolve this. We would need the searchers who did the metal detector sweep. We would need Detective Payne, who received the tip. We would need the persons who found the knife. There's another 3 people who found it, and then the analysis of the knife by Mr. Matheson. We're talking about quite a lot of time to chase down something that is completely not only irrelevant but ludicrous in this trial.
Blazier?
I resent the notion that we planted this evidence. There were 4 people that have nothing to do with this case that we've talked to who found that
I
knife.
didn't hear that comment made, Counsel.
Well, I did. I'm sorry. They say it's not relevant because they don't want to believe it. It has blood on it that's consistent with the blood under the fingernails. That makes it relevant, whether they like it or not. It is relevant evidence, and everything that she said goes to weight. It should not go to admissibility.
All right. I'll make the, for the purpose of this particular item, the package of reports, Court's Exhibit number 10. All right, let me read it. We'll take a recess and we'll see what we do with it.
Before we do that, I would like to make a record on the exhibit, if I might.
Counsel, you've had your opportunity.
Your Honor, I don't think we did that on the record, and I apologize if I've missed some step here, but I don't like to play a guessing game, and I'm sorry, and I apologize for that. But I don't know what you want. I thought that we had covered everything that we had talked about, and I'm asking as a courtesy for some guidance. That's all.
We'll stand in recess. Times sustain the objection, first on the basis of foundation, secondly on the basis of Evidence Code Section 352. Given the, at this point, speculative nature as to where this particular item came from, how it was found, how it was came to the police attention at a date significantly past the relevant dates where these locations were previously searched, I'll sustain the objection.
Your Honor.
As to the exhibit, Mr. Blazier, the court's concern is the initial assumption as to the initial amount. What I'm saying to you and what I've indicated to you is that at this point, I don't think you have the foundation for it. At some later point in time, I suspect you will.
No, I thought that maybe that's what you were getting
Yes,
at. What I
that's-
wanted to do, though, and is do that subject to connection. And obviously, I can make an offer of proof that the nurse testified at the prelim that it was 8 milliliters, and the people have been allowed to introduce test results from that blood vial subject to connection. And I'm simply asking for the same. Their exhibit boards were subject to connection as well.
All right. My problem, though, with this one, Mr. Blazier, is that it is in the form of argument, and since it is demonstrative evidence,
Actually, Your Honor, I have a plate to cover up that. I have a plate so that there's no text on it at all. Could I use it under those circumstances?
let me see it. Since you've modified it since yesterday morning?
Sorry?
You've modified it since yesterday morning.
No, actually, I had a plate just in case there was a problem with that particular entry. For me.
Works for me. You know, if you anticipate these things to begin with, Mr. Blazier, I mean, why do we have these pitch battles over things that you... Well, never mind. Never mind.
Honestly. You don't want this. Your Honor, the court now will pursue its ruling as to the use of the...
I said that that could not be used given the way it was marked because I didn't think it was factually correct. All right?
But there's still some factual inaccuracies that I mentioned to the court yesterday, which I don't think the court felt you have to get to, such as the fact that the dates are,
I thought all of
amounts
that-
were approximations. On the business records, they have a little squiggly.
No, I understand that. All right, given the modifications, I'm sorry, Mr. Goldberg.
And on one of them, it indicated that Mr. Matheson had removed blood on the 25th when it was Mr. Matheson had removed blood on the 25th when in fact it was Mr. Yamauchi.
I thought all the notations had been withdrawn from that.
Are all of them withdrawn?
I won't put anything up there.
All I saw was a test tube and amounts. That's what I saw. I saw no dates, times, places, people.
I did have some tag. I'll only do what he agrees with. Certainly. I won't do the one with,
Just out of curiosity, given the magnetic nature of that, how heavy is that?
actually, it's not.
Well, the amounts don't designate that they're approximates. And there is no designation of the amount that Mr. Matheson during his testing.
Mr. Goldberg will tell me how to make an approximate blank for that. I'll be happy to do it. I don't know how.
All right.
Approximation.
All right, any other comment, Mr. Goldberg?
Well, the problem with the amounts is that they're asserted to be definite. They're not approximations, and also there's no foundation from the witnesses as to how they measured them. We heard from Mr. Matheson how he made his estimations when he came up with an approximation that the blood vial contained 2 milliliters at a point in time that we know it had to have at least 3.8 milliliters. And from that, he concluded that he is at least has a margin of error of equal to or greater than 1.3 milliliters. So to put before this jury what is at this point an argument asserting precise numbers when we don't know how the measurement was made, we don't know under what circumstances, we don't know what the margin of error was on the measurements, is misleading. And also this doesn't calculate the amount of blood that stuck to the pipetters and the microcentrifuge tubes, which can be fairly considerable when you add it all up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, here's the thing, though. The court controls the order of proof. I'll allow this subject to a motion to strike. It's the same situation. The foundation for the blood itself, I've allowed subject to a motion to strike. I'll allow this, which is the same topic, subject to a motion to strike. Since all of this, this particular exhibit has been completely modified to take away all of the other notations other than the amounts. All right, let's proceed. Let's have the jurors, please.
Checked on the photographs, I'm sorry. And we did not get the particular photographs the defense introduced in discovery.
All right, we'll take that up at the noon break.
Thank you.
We'll take that up at the noon break. Matheson, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, record show reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Blazer, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, may I display the exhibit?
You may. Have we marked this yet?
I don't think we have.
11:39. Well, that may be the max there, Mr. Douglas, on this one.
Mr. Matheson, I want to ask you just a few more questions about the blood vial. And I want you to assume again, hypothetically, that there was originally 8 milliliters of blood in that vial. You have that in mind?
Yes.
Now, your records indicate, the business records indicate that on June 14th, Colin Yamauchi withdrew approximately 1 milliliter, correct?
Approximately, that's correct.
And I'm afraid this is much too high. Can you reach that? Take off the 1 milliliter?
Mr. Cochran, for the purpose of this presentation, I would suggest we move this over here so it's at workable level.
Your Honor, that's the only one that I can't reach.
Let's put it here. It'll be easy to work with.
Now, Mr. Matheson, do you agree that, following our hypothetical, that as of the 14th, after Mr. Yamauchi withdrew his approximately 1 milliliter, there would be approximately 7 milliliters left if you started with 8?
That's correct.
Now, the toxicology records that we talked about indicated that as of June 20th, there was 5.5 milliliters remaining, correct?
Approximately, according to the records, yes.
And there were no other withdrawals between Mr. Yamauchi's withdrawals on the 14th and when toxicology did their analysis on approximately the 20th, correct?
It's my understanding, yes.
So you would agree, would you not, that if that is the case, that there were approximately 1.5 milliliters of blood unaccounted for, gone from Mr. Simpson's reference to?
Argumentative, it's unaccounted for, Your Honor. Calls for.
Rephrase the question.
You know where that 1.5 milliliters went?
Assumes facts not in evidence, argumentative.
Overruled. Rephrase the question, though.
Would you agree that, according to your own business records, that if there were 5.5 milliliters of blood remaining on the 21st, and there had only been 1 milliliter taken out of that blood, and you started with 8, there'd be 1.5 milliliters unaccounted for?
Improper, hypothetical.
Overruled.
Also argumentative, it's unaccounted for.
Sustained.
Missing.
Rephrase the question.
1.5 milliliters less in that tube than you would expect.
Approximately, that's correct.
Now, the next withdrawal that your records indicate is on the 25th, and that would be, I'm sorry, the withdrawal for toxicology, would you agree that the records indicate that that microcentrifuge tube, which holds 1.5 milliliters maximum, was taken and some of that was returned?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Do you mean some of the tube or some of the blood in the tube?
No, let me do that one again. The blood vial that you've examined that we saw in the picture has that microcentrifuge tube back in it, correct? With the vial.
Yes, that's correct.
And there's still some blood in that microcentrifuge tube, correct?
Yes, there is.
And that originally, as a maximum, would have held 1.5 milliliters, correct?
Correct.
And according to Mr. Yamauchi's notes, he estimated that there was approximately 3/4 of a mil left, correct?
That's what he recorded, yes.
Now, would you agree that, therefore, toxicology would have used approximately, at a maximum, 3/4 of a milliliter?
At a maximum, yes.
Now, if we remove 3/4 of a milliliter, we're now down to roughly 6.2, 6.3. Would you agree?
Approximately, yes.
Now, the next withdrawal was Mr. Yamauchi on the 25th for purposes of ABO typing and other serological typing, correct?
Yes.
And his records indicate that he took approximately 0.75, correct?
That's correct.
Now, I'm going to take down 0.70 to be conservative, even though it was 0.75.
I object to that being conservative. That's an underestimation.
Sustain, rephrase that.
Well,
That's argument, counsel.
Okay.
Just take it down.
I'm trying to figure out how to get to 0.75 here. This is approximately 0.05. Is that approximately 0.05? Very small amount, isn't it?
In relation to your rest of your bars, yes, it is.
And if you remove 0.75, according to the business records that you've referred to, that would leave, at that point, approximately 5.5, correct?
Yes.
Now, you indicated at that point that you took, there was a small thread of just a couple of drops by Mr. Yamauchi on about the 27th, correct?
That misstates the
thread.
testimony.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
On the 27th or thereabouts, Mr. Yamauchi took an extremely small amount for a thread for electrophoresis, correct?
He prepared threads for electrophoresis, that's correct.
And that requires almost nothing, correct?
Well, the threads themselves require very little, but you do have loss in what's in the spot plate and what's in the pipetter.
Okay. Now, the defense was allowed to take 1 milliliter in September, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And there are records of that, are there not?
They were given approximately 1 milliliter, that's correct.
Now, you indicated that at some point you took out some blood, but the amount is not reflected in any business record anywhere.
That's correct.
So as far as the business records are concerned, in terms of what's written down when there are withdrawals, when there is an amount indicated, under the hypothetical, if, incidentally, have we taken off everything to account for all of the withdrawals where there is an amount written down?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. The only thing remaining is the one that you didn't write the amount down, correct?
That's correct.
Now, assume hypothetically again that on January, when you measured the quantity of blood left in both the reference tube and the microcentrifuge tube, there was a total of 2.6 milliliters. You have that assumption in mind?
Going off that assumption, yes.
Would you agree that under that hypothetical, following just the business records of withdrawals, that as of January of 1995, there would be a total of approximately 1.9 milliliters of blood unaccounted for? Unaccounted
Object
for,
to the phrase unaccounted for is argumentative.
unaccounted for by the business records.
Well, it's still argumentative.
If you're referring to only those that are specifically recorded and not taking into account what is left in pipettes, but actually what was delivered in certain areas, then that's a approximation, yes.
And by your earlier testimony in terms of the number of swatches, if you could get 150 swatches out of 1.5 milliliters, you could get correspondingly more swatches out of 1.9. Would you agree with that?
Yes, given the hypothetical.
Now, the only other withdrawal that we know about that you've testified is the one that you did where you did not write down any particular amount, correct?
As I'm sitting here right now, right, that sounds correct.
And you indicated that you started with a half to 1 milliliter? That's your best recollection?
I would say I used a minimum of a half mil, and it could be as high as 1.
And according to what you had told us before, you don't recall it now, but you put it back.
Well, I remember making that comment.
I'm sorry,
yes.
what you didn't use.
That's correct.
And you used approximately 6 to 8 drops?
That is the amount that would actually be consumed in the test. That is not the amount that would not make its way back to the vial.
Okay. There are other amounts like clinging to the side of the or whatever, the pipette or whatever you use to remove the blood, correct?
That's correct. That's why I gave the low end of being a 0.5 milliliter.
Okay. And you now you indicated, I think, a couple days ago that rough estimate on what might have been caught on the side of the tubes was 1/4 of a mil, 0.25.
That's a rough approximation, as possible.
Now, and the 6 or 8 drops accounts for approximately how much?
As far as,
How many milliliters?
well, if we're using 20 as an approximation of the number of drops per mil, that's a little less than half a milliliter.
A little more than 1/4.
Yes.
So if we say, therefore, then approximately 1/4 to half is lost on the sides of the containers and is used up by you, and you took out 1 to start with, that would reduce the total amount of blood in the vial by a milliliter. Do you agree?
In that instance, yes, that'd be an approximation.
And if we remove a half a milliliter, we have now accounted for all of the known withdrawals that are recorded anywhere from Mr. Simpson's reference sample, correct?
That's argumentative because it was based on the hypothetical.
Sustained.
Hypothetically, under our hypothetical we've been talking about, we've accounted for everything that, under the hypothetical, was taken out of Mr. Simpson's reference tube, correct?
Well, you've accounted for everything except for, we gave the situation of the approximate amount that would be left in the vial that I worked on, or the centrifuge tube that I worked on. We have not taken into account, excuse me, every other transfer device or measuring device that is done by other people. Example being when we gave a milliliter to the defense on the date, I believe it was September 30th, there is going to be some retained in that. We delivered approximately a milliliter, but there's going to be a little bit more. And every time you open the cap up, there's blood clinging to the inside of the cap. You set that down normally with a Kim wipe, blood is going to be lost into the Kim wipe at that point. So there's constantly little bits that are going out just in the process of handling, and that has not yet been taken into account.
Now, would you say approximately 1 milliliter was removed? That means it could be less, too, correct? All of those approximations could be lower.
Well, in relation to the one that Mr. Yamauchi did, on my transfer, the amount that I provided for the defense, that was done with a calibrated pipette. So 1 milliliter was delivered, then plus whatever adhered to the tips and to the vials and that type of thing would have been not returned.
But with the other entries, withdrawals that your people did, those are estimates and it could be slightly less than a milliliter, correct?
They are approximations, yes. They could be either slightly less or slightly more.
So would you agree under the hypothetical that as of January, taking into account all the other withdrawals that we talked about, there is still approximately 1.5 milliliters that is not accounted for from the records and from your recollection of the withdrawal?
Argumentative as to accounted for.
I would say that it is probably less than that because of the other factors I mentioned, like losing it in the handling, opening the tube and the pipettes and that type of thing.
Now, Mr. Matheson, I want to ask you some questions about the blood found under Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails. Do you have that in mind?
Yes, I do.
Now, is it true that in homicide cases, particularly homicide cases involving some form of assault or physical assault, it is routine to collect the fingernails of the victims?
Yes, it is.
And the purpose for that is that the victim, possibly in an assault case, might fight back and might scratch someone and therefore get biological material like blood from the perpetrator under the fingernails, correct?
That's one of the reasons for collecting them, yes.
And there's even more reason to do that if you have an assaultive situation where the victim has defensive wounds on his or her hand, indicating a possible struggle.
Argumentative beyond the scope.
Overruled.
No foundation for this opinion.
Sustain.
In any event, those are routinely taken for purposes of determining whether you can identify a perpetrator's blood under a victim's fingernails, correct?
Asked and answered.
Overruled. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, as I understand it, that was done in this case, and you conducted an examination of the scrapings from under the fingernails of Nicole Brown Simpson, correct?
That's correct.
And there were scrapings taken from both hands under all the fingernails on each hand, correct?
Yes.
And the numbers that we've used to designate those are 84A and B, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's the evidence item number that was used and the number that you've used in your lab for your testing purposes, correct?
Yes.
And 84A is which hand?
Referring to my analyzed evidence report that lists those items, 84A is the left-hand scrapings, 84B is the right-hand scrapings.
And the test results that you got from running an EAP test were that the blood under those nails on both hands was a type B, correct?
That's what the results were, yes.
And there is no one in this case that you have identified that has an EAP type B, correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Simpson doesn't have an EAP type B, does he?
No, it does not.
So would you agree then that if your test results are accurate, that there is blood under Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails from someone other than Mr. Simpson?
If the B is an actual B, yes, that's correct.
And that's the results that you reported out, was a B, correct?
Well, that misstates his report and his findings.
Overruled.
That's correct, along with a explanation alternative.
I have that. Mr. Manson, let me show you People's 218. Now you testified that was your analyzed evidence report, stating the results of your testing on the fingernails, among other things?
No, it is not.
There's another document that is actually your report, correct?
No, this is a report on a completely different set of items.
Have you been shown your report on the fingernails?
I have that sitting in front of me in my notebook. It isn't what you handed me.
May I have a document marked, please? A 3-page document titled Analyzed Evidence Report.
1140, Mrs. Robertson? All right, 1140, Mr. Blazer. Why don't you compare that with what Mr. Matheson has in his notebook?
Dated 9/8/94.
What,
Let me, I thought that was the other 3-page report.
I think it was 2/8.
That's what we just looked at.
Mr. Matheson has 218, he indicates that is the wrong report.
Oh, no, what I have in front of me is 2 pages that are marked as 216 and a third page that is 218. It's a mixture of my 2 sets of reports.
All right, why don't you take a look at that, Mr. Blazer? They appear to be paper clipped together. An unusual clerical,
I think maybe, probably accidentally, we got reports mixed up yesterday or day before.
Well, I think there's one report that only has one.
I'd like to still have this marked as 1140.
what is it, Mr. Blazer?
It is an analyzed evidence report dated 9/8/94.
All right, so marked. Proceed.
Mr. Matheson, let me show you a document titled Analyzed Evidence Report dated 9/8/94. That is your complete report for the analysis of these items, including the fingernails, correct?
It is a copy of it, yes, with some areas that have been blacked out.
Now let me show you Prosecution Exhibit 218. What is that?
This is the third page, or a copy of the third page of that analyzed evidence report.
And that was not provided to you at the time you were asked to testify about your report by the prosecution, was it?
It's vague and also not relevant.
Sustained.
Have you testified about page 2 of that document at all yet in this proceeding?
Not relevant.
Sustained.
Take a look at page 2, please, for me.
Okay?
Now,
And when you say that document, are we talking about 1140?
yes.
All right.
When you do a test, such as the test that you did on the fingernails, you have what are called work papers, correct?
There are electrophoresis worksheets, yes.
And those are documents that you fill out while you're doing the actual bench work. You write down your observations of what you think the results are and how the test is done and that sort of thing, correct?
Yes, it is.
And after you do that, you prepare a final report from those bench notes, correct?
Actually, the bench notes of all the different electrophoresis runs that are associated with a case then are placed onto what we call a summary sheet, which brings all the results from all the tests together into one place, along with some of the observations. Then the information from the summary sheet is then transferred onto the final report.
And the summary sheet is your final reading of typing for tests that you've done, correct?
It lists, yes, the final readings.
Now, I'd like to display something on the to
to a showing of this report as it's being done right now.
What's the basis? Legal basis.
It contains inadmissible evidence, and it's confusing. Inadequate foundation. I can't articulate it.
All right, let me see, counsel, sidebar, let me have a, let me see the document. All right, Mr. Blazer, which chart is this?
I think it's 302.
No. Well, when it comes down, we'll take a look at it.
Mr. Matheson, you've seen that chart before, and you've testified about it, correct?
Yes, I have.
And in that chart, it's indicated, this, by the way, who prepared this chart?
It was prepared by the DA's office.
You didn't prepare it, did you?
No, I did not.
Item number 42 is the sample taken from the area under Nicole Brown Simpson, correct?
Yes, it is.
And one of the arguments that the prosecution is using to say that your test results on the nail scrapings are something other than they are.
Counsel, you need to rephrase that
Okay.
question. All right, and for the record, this is People's 202. The chart.
202. In your report that you prepared after your analysis, you determined that item 42 was inconclusive, correct?
That's correct.
And what's the scientific definition or meaning of the term inconclusive?
Inconclusive to me means that there's not a conclusive decision or conclusive statement that can be made about the results.
Doesn't it mean scientifically that you can make no statements about the source of the stain when it's inconclusive?
Well, I don't report a inconclusive result. So yes, I would not make a statement about the source based on an inconclusive result.
Now, but in this case, you're asking to make some conclusion about the source of the stain of 42 even though it's an inconclusive, aren't you?
That misstates the evidence.
That's argumentative, the way it's phrased.
Now, on your final report, when you reported your findings on 84A and B, does your report say B asterisk?
No, it does not.
It says B, doesn't it?
Yes,
It says B for both the left hand and the right hand, doesn't it?
that's correct.
Now, do I understand that it's your position now from your testimony that you're asking that, or you're stating that the B is something other than a B?
That misstates the testimony too.
Overrule.
I am not saying that the B that I observed is anything other than what I am seeing, and that's the two bands in the B area. I'm merely stating that there's possible other explanations in addition to it being a type B.
Now, all of the other serological results that you testified to, you testified that your results are accurate, or you believe they're accurate, correct?
That also misstates the testimony.
Overrule.
I believe all of my results are accurate.
Is there any other test that you did where you got a reading or a result that you reported that you're asking us to accept as being inaccurate, except that one?
I'm not stating that this one is inaccurate. I'm just stating that there is an alternate explanation for what I'm seeing on the gel.
Okay, so it looks like a B, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And what you're saying is that, in your opinion, sometimes something else can look like a B that isn't a B, correct?
That's correct.
And that's a BA, correct?
That's correct.
But in this case, you saw a B, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Now, how long has the Los Angeles Police Department been using the EAP system?
I believe that we have been running EAP as part of a system for, it was in existence when I started doing my testing, which was in 1982, and I believe that it had been being used for a few years before that, 2 to 4, 6, something like that.
Can you give me just a real rough estimate of the number of cases that you've worked on where you've done an EAP test?
I would like to check my record and see if I made a estimation of that.
Sure.
Okay, the chart that I prepared of tests that I run did not include the EAP. I can give you a rough estimate based on some of the other markers that I've done.
Okay.
And I would say that I have run somewhere between, I don't know, probably 1,500 and about 2,000 items for that marker.
And an EAB type B is a fairly common type, isn't it?
I believe it is, yes.
So can you give us, you know what percentage of the population is a B?
I'd have to check another chart that I have.
Why don't you do that?
According to our statistics that we use, it's approximately 50% of the general population.
And would it be fair to infer from that that of the approximately 1,500 times you've done this test, roughly half of them would come back EAP-B?
That's correct.
And have you testified in court before about EAP results that have come back as a B?
Yes, I have.
And of course, in these approximately 750 cases, I assume you've written reports that have said, I tested it, looks like an EAP-B to me, correct?
Yes.
In all of those reports, do you write down, you know, it could be a BA?
Not in all those reports, no. I do include that disclaimer when the EAP is a source of elimination or exclusion in a sample.
Have you testified in court where an EAP-B happens to be the type of the suspect and also the evidence you tested that it's an EAP type B without giving that disclaimer?
Like I just mentioned, I will put that it's a B unless it's an exclusion of some type.
Can I take that as a yes? You have so testified in cases that an EAP-B result is a B when it incriminates a defendant without saying that it could have been a BA?
Yes.
Now, as I understand your argument that this B that you found is something other than a B is based on two things. One, scientific literature.
Mr. Blazer, would
I'm sorry.
would you rephrase that question, please?
Yeah.
When you start out your argument that
You testified yesterday that one of the reasons you're here to say that this B might have been a BA is because of the scientific literature, correct?
That's one of the things, yes.
And one of the other things is that that you testified to, is that because sample 42 has the same findings or similar findings as 85, and since 42 appears to have come from the victim, then therefore the blood on the fingernails may have come from the victim as well. Have I got that right?
No, I believe the other reason that I use is personal experience in both this case and other cases.
Did you not use the example of 42 as well?
Yes, but I don't think that was your question on this particular instance.
Have you ever written any papers or published anything on EAP systems?
No, I have not.
Have you? A couple of rare types that are almost never found.
There are many rares, yes.
For all practical purposes, the field is limited to an A, a B, or a C.
Correct.
Now, if someone inherited the B characteristic from both parents, then they would appear as a B.
That's correct.
And if someone inherited the A characteristic from both parents, they would be an A.
That's true.
And if someone inherited an A from mom and a B from dad, they'd be a BA.
That's correct.
And that's basically how it works. And the same thing would apply if you got a C from one of your parents.
Yes.
Now, the way you determine what an EAP type is by looking at the bands on the gel to see where they stopped when you turned the current off, correct?
That's one of the factors in this, yes.
And you've seen these slides before. We looked at these yesterday. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
And the slide that's up there now is your electrophoretic for run number 7310, correct?
Yes, it is.
And does that appear to be an accurate picture of that slide?
Yes.
Now, I might indicate that we talked about this yesterday. Sometimes these slides, when you scan them in the computer, don't pick up all of the nuances of the banding patterns, correct?
Oh, that's correct. Yes, some things may not show up as well being projected like this and looking at the original photograph.
And we have the original photographs, so we can look at those at some point, correct?
Yes, I have them here.
Now, could we go to the next slide, please? Now, I've drawn a box around a lane in the middle of this electrophoretic, correct?
Yes.
And this is what's called a standard. In other words, you knew what this was before you tested it, correct?
That's correct.
And you knew this was a BA.
That's true.
And the reason you do this is so that you can look at your unknown evidence that you're testing and, well, rephrase that. The reason you do this is because you want to see if the test worked okay. If this comes back the way you expected it to, that's a good indication the test worked.
That's one of the reasons, yes.
Now, this particular lane in the middle, this BA standard, came back the way it's supposed to, didn't it?
That's a typical looking BA, yes.
And let's go to the next slide. This slide C. Now, I've drawn boxes around the various bands in that standard, and there are 4 bands, correct?
Yes, there are.
Go to the next slide, please. Now, I've removed the picture from the background so it's a little bit easier to see. Those 4 bands are called B1, A1, B2, and A2, aren't they?
That's one of the designations for them, yes.
We do the next slide, please. Now, I've colored them in so that they're a little bit easier to distinguish. Now, if someone is an A, they're going to have 2 bands located at A1 and A2, correct?
Yes,
That's what you would expect to see.
that's correct.
If somebody is a B, you would expect to see 2 bands, one at B1, one at B2, correct?
Yes,
Go to the next slide, please. Now, would you agree that if you saw that particular banding pattern depicted on slide F, that's a BA?
It's a rough graphical demonstration of it. It has a little bit of a problem in that it doesn't indicate the intensity differences in the bands.
Okay, well, let me ask you about that. You talked about how the intensity of a band might affect the reading, correct?
It definitely does affect the reading, yes.
Now, C bands, which are not on this diagram, correspond in position to the B bands, don't they?
Yes, they do.
So that you can have a C with a banding pattern that is at the same spaces on the electrophoretic as the B, correct?
That's correct. The two C bands run the same distances as the B bands.
And one of the ways that you tell the difference between a C and a B is by the differences in intensities of those two bands, correct?
Well, not one of the ways. The way
The
is
way.
to tell the difference, look at the difference in the intensities or brightnesses of the bands.
Right. Now, if you're talking about comparing an A and a B, however, none of those bands overlap, do they?
No, they do not.
So if your universe is limited to an A or a B, band intensity is irrelevant, correct?
No, that's not true.
What is the effect of band intensity on telling the difference between an A and a B?
Well, as far as telling the difference between the two, I'm sorry if I misunderstood your last question. It doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference when evaluating the sample and whether or not you call it, because you
Okay.
expect to see intensities in certain ways as far as the result goes.
Okay. But as far as distinguishing an A from a B, it's irrelevant.
The intensities, that's correct.
Now, if we have the next slide, please. Now, this is the pattern you would expect to see with a type B, correct?
Again, except for the fact that the B2 is the more intense and would be larger, and the B1 is less intense.
Okay, but in terms of relative position, that's correct, isn't it?
That's true.
Next slide, please.
Hold on, this one is which?
That was G. This is H.
All right, you need to, for the purpose of the record, let me know which one
Okay.
you're bringing up.
And correspondingly, the column on the right, that's what an A would look like in terms of the position of the bands.
Yes, that's true.
Next slide, please. This is I. Now, Mr. Matheson, this is a picture of the electrophoretic that contains the fingernails, is it not?
Yes, it is.
Now, this has a lot of little dots and things on it that are extraneous results that sometimes come up in these tests, correct?
That's correct. The dots, the round dots that you see are not related to the EAP or the information from the samples.
And the scientific term for that is schmutz, isn't it?
Actually, I don't think I've heard that term, but
Okay. Mr. Scheck told me. Next slide, please. This is J. Now, I've circled or boxed 3 lanes of that electrophoretic, correct?
yes, you have.
And the lane on the right of the box is your BA standard lane, correct?
That's correct.
And the 2 lanes next to it, to the left, are 84A and 84B, correct?
Yes.
Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to isolate just those 3 bands, correct?
Yes.
And that's slide K. Now let's go to L. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so we can look at it a little more carefully. Now let's go to M. Now I've drawn boxes around the bands in their approximate positions, correct?
The approximate position, yes.
Now let me back up a little bit. When we saw the picture of the electrophoretic, it looked like it was a little bit bowed down at the sides, correct?
Oh, it was quite a bit bowed
Quite
at
a
one
bit.
point, yes.
And that happens sometimes as a function of the way the test is done, correct?
Yes.
It doesn't invalidate the test, does it?
No.
Because you can adjust the bow to figure out where the bands are, and essentially straighten it out, in essence, to figure out which band you're looking at, can't you?
You can sometimes, yes.
Now, the bands that I've boxed there are slightly out of line with the standard because the electrophoretic was bowed a little bit, correct?
Yes.
And would you agree that the boxes that I've put around the bands are the bands that you read when you did this test?
Well, that's vague as to the bands you read.
Overruled. Do you understand the question, sir?
Yes.
All right.
In
Now,
the,
I'm sorry.
In the case of 84A and 84B, those are two bands that are visible. That is not the only parts of that area that are taken into account.
But those are the bands that are there.
That's correct.
And next slide, please. Now we're taking the background out, give it, so you can see it a little bit better. That's N. Now let's do M.
I'm going to object at this point on the grounds previously stated. That I
Noted.
thought were going to be clarified.
You were going to ask a question regarding the alignment of the boxes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I did. Mr. Matheson on, is this slide? O. I've indicated that the bands from the fingernails are bands B1 and B2, and that's the bands that we saw on the electrophotogram, correct?
For those items under the 84A and 84B, that's correct. They're roughly where they are. Don't take into account the curve, and they don't take into account the intensity differences.
Right. And if we adjusted the curve, those bands under 84A and 84B would line up with the standard B bands in the standard BA, correct?
That's correct.
Next slide, please. Now, and as you read in your report, the fingernail, I'm sorry, as you reported in your report, your reading of that test was that both fingernails from both hands were type B, correct?
That's correct.
And that was slide T. P. Let's go to Q. Now we're back to our standard BA in Q. Let's go to R. Let's go to S. Now, part of your testimony the other day concerned the manner in which a BA can degrade, correct?
That's correct.
Now, if you have a BA, you would have the banding pattern that we have up on slide S, correct?
Again, not taking into account the intensity differences, but that's the locations of the bands.
Now, I want you to assume, for purposes of hypothetical, that the degradation that occurs when a BA degrades involves bands disappearing from the top down.
Improper hypothetical, no foundation for it.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Mr. Matheson, let me ask you about some of the scientific literature. You referred to an article by Grunbaum and Zajac in your direct testimony. You recall that?
I was directed to that, yes.
There's other literature on the EAP systems, correct?
Yes.
And you're familiar with that other literature, are you not?
I've read some of them, yes.
And you were provided a copy with a number of different articles the other day, were you not?
No, I was not.
Are you familiar with an article by Dr. George Sensabaugh entitled The Utilization of Polymorphic Enzymes in Forensic Science?
I'd like to see it, please.
Sure.
I've seen this, yes.
And have you relied upon that in the way you evaluate the EAP system?
It's overbroad. Question is phrased.
Overrule.
I have read this article, and there is information in it that regarding the EAP in general, is one of many references that I have referenced in relation to the EAP system.
So it's one that you have considered and referred to.
I have considered some of the information.
Vague as to considered in what? In rendering opinion?
We'll get there in a second.
Did you do any research at all before your testimony on the rate at which, according to the scientific literature, a BA degrades to a B?
I have done some reading on that, yes.
What things did you read?
Well, there was 3 or 4 articles that I read that related to degradation of EAP in general and many of them that reference one particular way that it degrades.
What articles did you read?
I could, I think a reference to give you a couple of them.
Yes.
As mentioned earlier, one of the ones that I've read is this article that you presented before me. I also read an article entitled Erythrocyte Acid Phosphatase in Blood Stains by Raxel and Eames.
Let me show you an article. That's it, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I also referenced a book called the Source Book. Source Book in Forensic Serology, Immunology, and Biochemistry. And I also read portions from a book called Forensic Science Handbook by Richard Saperstein.
Are you familiar with a technical note by a T.E. Yeshion, Y-E-S-H-I-O-N, titled Thermal Degradation of Erythrocyte Acid Phosphatase Isoenzymes in a Case Sample?
I read that one the other day, yes.
And this handing you appear to be that article.
Yes, it appears to be.
And have you reviewed and considered an article by R.A. Fisher and Harry Harris titled Studies on the Separate Isoenzymes of Red Cell Acid Phosphatase Phenotypes A and B?
And I'd like to see it, please. This one does not look familiar to me.
Let's take a look at this.
Now, other than the Grunbaum article, incidentally, let me show you a copy of that and ask if this is the article that you testified about the other day.
Yes, it appears to be.
Other than the Raxall article, the Yeshian article, the Grunbaum article, and the Sensibar article, are there any other scientific articles that you have reviewed specifically to look for how a BA degrades
It's vaguest time.
Overruled.
in preparation for this case?
I believe I mentioned two other references, something that is commonly called Source Book and another a textbook by Saperstein.
And I was talking about articles devoted to that topic specifically rather than textbooks.
Oh, I'm sorry. To the best of my recollection, that's it.
Okay. What do those articles say about the rate at which a BA degrades?
Rate meaning the amount of time it takes? Or
No. Which bands disappear first?
Most of the articles make reference to the fact that degradation does in fact occur and that as a rule, it tends to go from the anodal or the faster bands down towards the cathodal or slower bands.
Would you agree that those articles stand for the proposition that at the first stage of degradation, you lose the A2 band?
It's overbroad as to those articles.
Sustain.
The articles we've been talking about.
It's still overbroad.
Sustain.
Sensiba, Zajac, Yeshian, and Raxol. Those 4 articles. Would you agree that the results of their scientific tests are that the first thing to disappear is the A2?
Assumes that they all did scientific tests, background evidence.
Overruled.
They do tend to point out that the most labile or the first one to go is, in fact, that fastest
Next
A2
slide.
band.
I'm sorry, next slide. This is T. So after that first stage of degradation, your BA is going to look like the right-hand column of slide T, according to the scientific literature, correct? This scientific literature.
According to those articles, that's the degradation route that they have seen.
Now, those articles also state, do they not, that the next stage of degradation is you lose the B2 band.
Well, it assumes that there's only one degradation route, background evidence.
Overruled. This is in reference to these articles.
Yes.
That's the general route that those articles reference, yes.
Okay, the next slide, please. This is what? You. So would you agree, would you not, that these articles indicate that the next stage of degradation you would see, if you had a BA that was degrading, you would see 2 bands, the B1 and the A1 band?
Under the conditions that those studies were run in, yes, that is the general route of degradation.
Now, those studies further indicate, do they not, that the next thing to go when it degrades is the A1 band, correct?
That's the general route of that form of degradation, yes.
Next slide, please. The B. So therefore, according to these articles, a BA that's degrading will ultimately, before the last band disappears, have the B1 band there, correct?
Again, according to the conditions that those samples are treated and under the conditions they are run, that is the degradation route that's referred to.
Agree that under that degradation route, you never have the pattern of a BA that's degraded that has both the B1 and the B2 bands without the A1 band.
Again, given the things I mentioned before, the condition of the samples in those studies, and the system they used for identifying it, that is true.
And in this case, your test results showed both the B1 and the B2 band without the A1 band, didn't they?
That's correct.
So under this scientific literature, if this BA was a degraded, if your B under the fingernails was a degraded BA, it wouldn't look like the results you got, would it?
If my sample or the samples that I analyzed were under those conditions in those studies and run in the same way, that's correct.
Can you cite me to a single scientific article that states that the degradation route taken by a BA when it degrades would ever get you to the point where you're going to have a B1 and a B2 without the A1?
And we're talking specifically about articles at this point.
Yes.
No, I cannot.
I think you said also, let me turn that off now. Now, none of those articles that we've talked about, the reason cited in those articles for doing these studies is to find out how a BA degrades, correct? So that was one of the purposes of all these articles.
Well, it's known that it does degrade, so yes, the purpose of those articles, potentially among other things, because they include other bits of information, is to determine one of the ways that a EAP will degrade.
And all of those articles talk about you could misinterpret a BA or B, you could misinterpret a BA for a B if you made a reading based on just that B1 band at the end, correct?
That's correct.
And they all say that, therefore, you shouldn't make any reading at all if all you have is one B1 band, correct?
That's correct.
But they say also that you will not have a mistyping where you have a B1 and a B2 band, because that would not be a degraded BA, correct?
I don't believe they all say that, no.
Can you show me one that doesn't say that?
It's going to take me a few minutes to look. I believe they say that are things that may happen, but
Well, counsel, let's move on. We're not going to sit here and read articles.
They do say that you can accurately read a BA and a B as long as there are two bands present. In other words, you can read a B if there are two bands present accurately, correct?
It's incomplete as to what conditions.
Sustain. Actually, when you say they, I think you need
In the-
to specify which articles.
Do any of the articles say that you should not call a B where you have both the B1 and B2 bands?
no, they don't.
Do they all say that you shouldn't make any call at all if you only have one band?
It's my understanding, yes.
Now, you also testified that item 42 had the same appearance, or the same reading as the fingernails, correct?
No, I don't believe I said they had the same reading or the same appearance.
Can we go back to slide A? Now, you recognize slide A up there as being the one we were talking about with the standard?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree that the lane next to the standard that we used, in fact, why don't you go to the next slide, slide B, that the lane just to the right of the standard lane is actually it's to the left of the box is item 42.
Yes, adjacent to the other standard.
Now, let me show you a photograph. Does this appear to be a photograph of that same electrophotogram?
Yes, it does. It appears to be an enlargement of it.
And item 42 appears in that electrophotogram as it does in the slide on the projector, correct?
I was in the same location, and it's much easier to read in this photograph.
Now, you can pick up a little bit more in the photograph than you can on the slide, correct?
Object to the phrase a little bit more.
Rephrase it.
You can see some very, very faint banding patterns under 42 that doesn't completely show up in the slide, correct?
That's correct.
Maybe we could try to put this on the Elmo. Illustrate.
I think that's when we may have to have both up and have the jury look at the blow up.
That's fine. Can we try this?
Well, yeah, I've tried, but I'm just trying to save some time here.
In fact, let me. Okay. We can see a little bit better this way. Would you agree?
A little bit better.
And would you agree that the lane for item 42 appears to have three very faint bands corresponding to B1, A1, and B2? Very faint.
Well, the B1 and B2, I believe I can see what are banding areas, very kind of fuzzy, difficult to read. There is kind of a brightish cloud in the A1 region.
And the photograph is 1141 A1. Now the very faint, can you see behind you on the screen up there? The very faint fuzzy A1 band is what I've got the light on, correct?
That misstates the evidence.
Well,
Or
right about there.
Well, there is some fluorescence in that area. It's not even really what I would call a band.
It's not, and that one of the reasons that this was an inconclusive is because those are not sufficiently well-defined bands to really make a type on, correct?
Those is overbroad. Which of the
The faint markings you see in lane 42.
It was called inconclusive, right, because the bands that I visualized in there just were not what I would call clear-cut bands.
And let me show you a photograph of the fingernail slide that appear to be a similar photograph.
Yes, it does.
And this would be 1141 J1. And I'd like to put both of these on at the same time. If I could. Now, you see the two photographs that we have on the projector.
Yes, I do.
And the 42, again, is the one that I have the laser light on now up in the big projector. Can you see that behind you?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the light that I'm using on the large projector up above you is the 42 lane, correct?
Yes, it is.
And the lanes over here, oh good, we've got the arrow. Can we move the arrow over to 84A and B? Right there. Those are the banding patterns from the fingernails, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And could we put an arrow over by 42 as well? Can you affix one there? Would you agree that the banding patterns for 84A and B are much more distinctive than 42?
Yes.
And that's why you read 84A and B and did not report anything other than inconclusive for 42.
It's one of the reasons, yes.
print of items 42 and 84. It was the two electrophoretograms of 42 and 84 side by side with arrows.
Now, your testimony the other day about 42 was to the effect that since 42 was preserved under similar conditions to 84A and B, therefore you can draw some kind of an analogy between the results of 42 and the results of 84, correct?
States the testimony.
Over.
I believe environmental conditions and the like was one of the things that we mentioned. that is used in the total consideration of everything.
Now, one of the photographs that you looked at of Nicole Brown Simpson showed one of her hands under her body and one of her hands up exposed to the air, correct?
Yes.
So those two were not under the same conditions in terms of drying or being in a pool of blood, were they?
Not exactly the same, no.
And would you agree that if you follow the scientific literature that I've shown to you and that you've reviewed, that the blood under Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails cannot be a BA?
It's an improper hypothetical.
Overruled.
I'm sorry, could you read that or repeat that, please?
Would you agree that under the scientific literature that we've reviewed here, that the blood under Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails cannot be a degraded BA?
If you look strictly at the literature and if the conditions under the fingernails are the same as the way the studies were done in the literature and the technique used to identify it was the same as that I used in my testing, then it does not follow that degradation route. That's correct.
And if that's true, then it has to have come from somebody else, correct?
Improper hypothetical.
Overruled.
Given all of the considerations that I mentioned, they would all have to be the same. And if, like I said, in fact, it did follow that same degradation route, then it would have to be a B and it would have to come from somebody else.
Now, if you have test results that you think might be wrong or ambiguous, what are you supposed to do as a scientist?
I would not report them if they are wrong or ambiguous.
If you thought that the results were wrong, would you redo the test?
Depends on what other tests were available to me.
Now, looking at EAP, well, if you do a PGM test or a DNA test, you're not looking at the same things as you're looking at an EAP, are you?
You're potentially looking at the same thing, but there are other factors. That's correct.
Nothing that you do other than an EAP test is going to give you an EAP reading, correct?
Oh, that's correct. Yes. I mean, only an EAP test is going to give you an EAP result.
So the only way that you could double check that EAP test would be to do another EAP test, correct?
Well, theoretically, if they knew what caused the EAP type at the DNA level, you could do it that way. I don't believe there's a standard test for that right now. So the only way to reconfirm that result would be to run the exact same test again.
These fingernail scrapings were sent back to you by the Department of Justice for the purposes of doing another EAP test, weren't they?
That misstates the testimony.
Sustained.
At some point, you sent them to DOJ and they sent them back, didn't they?
Yes, that's true.
What was the purpose for them sending it back?
Because it's our evidence. The evidence belongs back here when they're done completing it so that it could become part of the rest of the case.
Did you ever consider doing a retest of those fingernail scrapings, an EAP test, to see whether your original results were wrong?
Did I consider it?
Yes.
I considered it, yes.
You wanted to do it, didn't you?
I felt that there was other tests that could give more information. I did not want to consume any more of the sample just to repeat the exact same thing again.
So you've done no retesting to demonstrate whether this EAP is anything other than a B or someone other than Mr. Simpson, correct?
There has never been any other testing. I have not repeated or done any other EAP testing. That's correct.
No further questions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the morning session. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you. Do not conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. We'll stand in recess till 1 o'clock.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Goldberg, you had some comment or concern regarding discovery matters?
Yes, Your Honor. On the photographs that counsel use today of the blood vial. I do not believe that we were provided those in discovery. We have another set of defense photographs of the blood vial that we do have. Mr. Scheck tells me that he thinks that it's possible that the photographs that they use could be people's photographs. I did not have an opportunity over the noon hour to verify that, so at this time I can't be 100% sure that he's wrong. But this is a possible discovery violation. I'm just not in a position at this point to say it with certainty.
Well, given Mr. Matheson's testimony that he recognized it and testified to what it was, unless there's some other materiality to it, I'm not going to entertain any further comment on it then until you tell me it's relevant. All right. Let's have the jury. Gentlemen, please be seated. All right, Mr. Matheson, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, the record should reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Gregory Matheson is again on the witness stand, now undergoing a redirect examination. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Mr. Matheson. You're reminded you are still under oath, sir. Mr. Goldberg, you may commence your redirect examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Matheson. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Sir, I want to start out by asking you more about this EAP issue, and I know we've discussed it at some length. You were asked about some literature during cross-examination. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And specifically, you were asked about 4 articles that you were shown on the witness stand that you read prior to your testimony in court.
That's correct.
Now, you said at one point that those were the only articles that you considered prior to testifying about this EAP issue for your testimony in this proceeding.
That's correct.
But you alluded to some book that you looked at?
Yes, I did.
Now, why on cross-examination didn't you tell the defense about what was in this book?
No, I wasn't asked about it. I was limited to the articles.
You mean by the questioning?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I'd like to get into that in a little while, but first let's take a look at some of these articles that were referred to. Mr. Matheson, first on the Raxall and Eames article.
How do you spell that?
W-R-A-X-A-L-L, Eames, E-M-E-S.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is this one of the articles, sir, that you considered prior to your testimony?
It's one of the ones I read, yes.
And did this article actually contain a study that was done involving a number of samples to determine how it degrades, how the EAP marker degrades?
Yes, it did.
Now, on these stains that were studied in this particular article, were these stains in a wet condition or in a dry laboratory condition?
I believe they were dry.
Now, the stains at the scene, in this case, item 42, if we were to assume hypothetically that when Mr. Fung saw that, he described it as being tacky when he arrived there at some time after 10:15, would that distinguish the blood that we're talking about in our case from the type of blood that was studied in the Raxel article?
Your Honor, objection states the testimony if he's talking about the fingernails.
Sorry?
If he's talking about the fingernails.
Overruled.
If the blood was tacky or damp, then that would be a different set of conditions.
And when you looked at the bindles on one of the fingernail scrapings in this case, there was some evidence that it was tacky even when it was collected. Is that correct?
There was what appeared to be smearing on it that would indicate that it was still damp.
Now, why is this distinction between damp and dry stains in a laboratory condition? Well, let me ask it another way. Why is a distinction between damp stains at a crime scene as opposed to dry stains in a laboratory setting significant?
Well, it's different conditions.
But what's significant forensically about the different conditions in terms of degradation?
Well, a damp condition, like I mentioned before, hastens certain types of degradation. A dried sample, or even a damp sample for that case that's subjected to heat, is a different type of environmental situation and potentially could create a different type of result.
Now, with respect to the Raxel and Eames article, did you, in interpreting that article, take this as a cautionary type statement with respect to the EAP marker?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
So I don't.
Did you take this as a statement to a forensic analyst to use caution with the EAP marker in terms of typing it?
This meaning the whole article?
Yes.
Yeah, the crux to that and many of the other articles is just an indication that the EAP has a problem with degradation, and you need to be careful about how it's interpreted.
And is that how you interpreted the article overall?
Yes.
Now, is it correct that with respect to these dried laboratory stains that they were talking about in Raxel and Eames, they did identify a particular degradation route?
Yes, they did.
And I'd like to direct your attention back to our EAP board so maybe we can understand this. While we're getting that, maybe you can describe for us verbally what this degradation route was that was discussed both during cross-examination and also in Raxel.
My understanding of it is similar to what was discussed before, that under those conditions and identifying the samples the way they are, the process of identifying the types, the degradation route showed the progressive loss of the faster bands or the anodal bands, so that you lose first a A2, B2, A1, and then eventually the B1.
Let's take this step by step. You used the term anodal. What does that mean?
That is an electrical term. It refers to the positive side as opposed to the negative side, which is cathodal.
Looking at our EAP phenotype board, the block diagram that we've used, can you tell us which is the anodal side of the diagram?
Looking at the diagram, the anodal side is where the plus is on the left. The cathode is on the right where the negative is.
Why don't we take off the little magnetic strips? Okay, so With respect to the BA phenotype, can you describe for us the degradation route that was discussed by Raxel and Eames with respect to dried laboratory stains that were aged?
The degradation route, like previously described on cross,
Maybe you can use a pointer or something so that we can.
All right, and we're referring to People's Exhibit 217.
I believe so. Let me double check.
$217.
Yes.
the degradation route, as was previously described, but using this chart now to show it, would mean that you'd have a loss of the A band, which is indicated above, that's farthest to the left, then the B band, next one to the right of it, then the other A band, second band from the right, and then finally what has been marked as the C band.
And that is the degradation route that was described in this Raxel and Eames.
Yes, under the conditions that they had those samples.
Now, sir, in your experience as a serologist, and also based upon your reading of the literature, is that the only degradation route?
No, it is not.
Okay, and generally speaking, and maybe this is a slight oversimplification, you're saying this particular degradation route would be from the positive side to the negative side of the block diagram that we have.
The one I described earlier, yes.
But it is not the only one.
No.
Your Honor, I'm wondering if I might be able to use the defense exhibit on their block diagram showing the EAP degradation route.
Which item was that?
We don't have it in our system.
Mr. Harris, do you have that available? Do you know which number and letter you want? Have we printed those out yet, Mr. Harris?
Running that.
Okay. All right, while we're awaiting that, Mr. Goldberg, do you have any other matters you can take up?
It's 1141A through Z.
I think about L is what you're looking for, correct?
It sounds like it might be about
All
right.
right. Do you have anything else you can talk to,
Yes,
ask Mr. Matheson while we're waiting?
yes, I
Mr.
can
Blazer, I
continue.
appreciate your cooperation with that.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, too. Now, Mr. Matheson, you were also asked about a article by the name of, by the authors of Zajac, Z-A-J-A-C, Grunbaum, G-R-U-N-B-A-U-M, and Crim, C-R-I-M. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is this an article that came out after the one that we just discussed, the Raxel and Eames article?
I believe so, yes.
And is this the article that previously you testified said that inherent characteristics of the EAP system give rise to the possibility of very serious errors in phenotyping and other than fresh blood, especially if the history of the sample is not fully known?
Yes, it is.
Now, in this particular article on page 615,
This is Zajac.
yeah. Did they make reference to the Raxel and Eames article that you were asked about on cross-examination that we just discussed?
Yes, I believe it does.
And did they distinguish the Raxel and Eames article as dealing with a different situation from the situation that they were discussing in their article.
Yes.
Can you read for us what they said in order to distinguish Raxel and Eames from their article?
Yes, in referencing the Raxel and Eames article, they followed that up with stating apparently the bloodstains they used were prepared under laboratory conditions and the history and drying and preservation were well known.
And in Grunbaum, were they trying to give an idea of what would happen to wet samples that were not prepared under laboratory conditions?
Leading.
Well, in the article, what did they say? What kind of stains were they dealing with here?
Okay, the comment they made is that the preparation of their blood samples were done in such a way to simulate the adverse conditions which may take place in actual casework submitted to a crime lab.
Now, with respect to their article, did they identify the same degradation route that you just described that was discussed in the Raxel and Eames?
I don't believe it was specifically delineated there.
Did they say that, how did they characterize, can you read for us how they characterized the problems of misidentification that occurred in this particular study with the samples that they created?
It states the problem with misidentification of the samples in this study was not due to weak or indistinct band patterns. Rather, discrete bands were present and readable, but they had been altered to indicate erroneous phenotypes.
Okay, and how did you interpret that, Mr. Griffiths?
Well, again, that this system has degradation problems and that multiple bands can be read still and misinterpreted.
I mean, even if you have discrete band patterns, such as 2B bands.
I believe that indicates that.
Now, could I see 1141G, Mr. Harris? Is that possible? And then I want to see H and I. Okay, I want to go back to the Raxel and Eames article and the degradation route that they discussed. What does this represent when we're looking at the BA block diagram?
It represents a general location of the bands of a type BA.
All right, and the B block diagram?
It also represents the general location of the bands of a type B, though in neither case does it give any sort of indication of the intensity differences.
And then let's see, this is H. Can we see U? When you said that they don't give an indication of the intensity differences, you mean what?
Well, that's one of the ways of determining the types is, particularly between a B and a C, is how intense certain bands are. And these are just all being blocked as approximately the same size as opposed to the People's Chart on EAP, which does define the different intensities by the different sizes of the bands.
Okay, now, can you tell us what we're looking at here in terms of the degradation route?
This is consistent with the degradation route described in the Raxel article.
And that is what?
That you lose the bands from the anodal side or the plus side towards the cathodal side or the negative side, the slow side.
Can you orient this just verbally in relationship to the People's Chart, the 6 EAP diagrams on the block diagram, just to show us how the two would interrelate?
If you, excuse me, if you were to turn the chart that's being projected up, be 90 degrees to the left so that the arrow would indicate the origin or the cathodic side.
Okay. And can we see the next, it would be V on this, please? And now what does this show?
See, it's the final step in the degradation route that's described in the Raxel article, where what originally started out as a BA, the only thing that's left is the B1 band.
Okay, but you're saying that this degradation route that you were asked about is not the only one that you have seen or that is in the literature?
That's correct.
1141, is this a V? V is in Victor. The previous one was 1141U.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Now, the another one of the articles, the 3 articles that you were asked about, was the Yashan. Excuse me. Let me ask you about the Sensiba article first. Did the Sensiba article contain a broad-based study of the phenomena of EAP disintegration, or were they looking at only one stain when they discussed this degradation route, the one that we just saw in the defense?
It appears by reading that article that when they're referencing that degradation route that's been described in the Raxel article, that just 2 bloodstains were used, one of a type B and one of a type BA.
All right. And then finally, the Yashan article that was referenced. Did the Yashan article contain what purported to be a study of the phenomena of BA disintegration to B?
No, it did not.
What was that?
It was a technical note regarding the degradation of a B to a CB. I don't know if it then carried on to a C, but the A allele was not mentioned.
Okay, so Yashan was not actually studying, did not purport to be studying the BA to B phenomena per se.
That's correct.
She was studying other issues in the EAP marker system with respect to degradation.
Oh, I don't know about studying. She was referencing other issues, yes.
Now, with respect to all 4 of the articles we've mentioned so far, the Raxel and Eames, the Grunbaum and Zajac, the Sensiba, and the Yashan article, considered together, did you take those articles as some sort of a cautionary statement to the forensic analyst with respect to the EAP system?
Yes, I did.
How so?
And that is, I mean, every one of them indicates that the EAP enzyme, unlike the other ones, does in fact degrade, and that a degradation can lead to mistyping. So you have to be careful about how you interpret EAP results.
Now, when you were asked about the Raxel and Eames, well, let me ask you another question first. This book that you alluded to during your direct examination, what was the book?
It's the Forensic Science Handbook by Richard Saferstein.
And was there a particular portion of that book that you referenced in particular informing the opinions that you expressed on the witness stand with respect to the BA to B phenomena?
It enforced my knowledge of that, yes.
Can you tell us which portion you looked at?
It was a section that was written by Dr. Sensabaugh.
Maybe you can give us the page number, because I believe counsel may have a copy of that.
Well, it's chapter 8 that starts on page 338. The area that we are referencing, I believe the paragraph starts on 369 and concludes on 370.
Yeah, that, Mr. Blazier.
If I may look from that.
Excuse me.
Mr. Goldberg.
And did Mr. Sensabaum in this chapter that he authored mention the Raxel and Eames, or what we've discussed as being the Raxel and Eames degradation route?
Yes, it does.
Did he say that that was the only degradation route?
I don't believe so, no.
Can you tell us what he said?
Well, it makes reference to the stabilities of the isozymes. That are the different types. One quote here is that the A isozymes are the least stable and the C isozymes the most stable. Thus, one might expect the A bands in BA and CA types to be lost before the B or C bands are lost, and this, in fact, has been observed.
And does he say anything?
Unless the rest of that paragraph is read.
Mr. Goldberg.
I don't know what the legal basis of the objection is.
I think it's 256.
What?
256, I believe.
Sir, can you read the rest of the paragraph?
Be happy to.
Sure.
In typing aged type BA bloodstains, for example, only the major B band, the anodal B band, may be apparent, and the temptation would be to type the sample as a B. To avoid error of this sort, empirical rules for typing interpretation need to be invoked. Since it has been observed that in aged BA bloodstains, the slow B band is generally lost before the fast A band, the controlling rule is to withhold judgment on a putative B type until both B bands are apparent. If the sample is in fact a BA type, the major A band should be apparent by that time.
Now, did Mr. Sensabaum identify any particular degradation route that is different from the Raxel and Eames degradation route?
I feel that this article, or this paragraph, actually mentions a couple of different routes or discrepancies between the possible ways the degradation can occur.
Should move to strike as non-responsive.
How so? What other degradation route is identified there, sir?
Well, in one sentence, he states that in typing age type BA bloodstains, for example, only the major B band or the anodal B band, this is the anodal or the one closest to the anode side, as opposed to this band, which is a cathodal or closest to the origin, may be apparent. He's saying that at some point it's possible that only the major band or the brightest band might be present.
And how is that different from the Raxel and Eames?
In their study, they saw the degradation route so that the cathodal band was the last one that was apparent.
Maybe we can let's just cover up the A bands for a moment so that we can make them understand. In the BA, on the BA chart for the record, I just put the covers back over the A bands on the BA phenotype. Okay, so according to the Raxel and Eames study, they're saying that which band would remain after the sample had degraded?
The most cathodal one, or the one closest to the origin.
Okay, the one that's on the right side of this diagram.
That's correct.
And in this portion that you just read to us in Sensible, he's saying which?
In that one portion there, he makes reference to what he calls the major B band, or the cathodal B band, the anodal B band may be apparent.
And does he say that these degradation routes, that it always occurs in either of these two ways?
I didn't read that in there, no.
Does he say that that these are general ways that they happen, that this is how it generally happens?
There is the term generally used. Yes.
So in interpreting that, did you, as a forensic analyst, take that to mean that this is the only path, degradation path, that this marker will take, or that this is one of the degradation paths that this marker will take?
Objection.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
How did you take that term that this generally can take these two paths?
On reading that paragraph and the discrepancies between the different types, it indicates to me that there may be more than one way that degradation can occur.
And did you take the totality of the articles and the book that you just referenced, and also the source book that I think you referenced earlier in your cross-examination, as providing some sort of cautionary statement to the forensic analyst when trying to type a B and distinguishing it from a BA?
Yes.
And what was that?
Again, in general, that this is an enzyme that has degradation problems, and you just have to be careful about the interpretation of the results.
Did anything that you read in these articles, Mr. Matheson, cause you to change the statement that you made initially on your analyzed evidence report that you could not exclude the possibility that with respect to the fingernail scrapings, it was a BA that degraded into a B?
No, it did not.
Did anything that was brought up during cross-examination by the defense cause you to change the opinion that you've offered on direct, that probably the samples underneath the fingernails were a BA that degraded to appear to be a B?
I'm not sure about the term.
Objection to state testimony.
Sustained.
Okay. What was your opinion, your bottom line opinion, when you considered all of the facts of this case as you are aware of them, including the photographs of where the victim's body was, the pool of blood, item number 42, and the other tests that you did? What was your opinion as to the fingernail scrapings?
Well, the result does not change. I did see a B, but in considering absolutely everything, I would have to say that it is a likelihood that the blood that was found under the fingernails were in fact from Ms. Brown and had degraded. But again, I cannot totally eliminate the possibility that it's a B.
Okay. Now, did anything that was brought up during cross-examination cause you to change that opinion or reevaluate that?
No, it did not.
Now, sir, with respect to resolving this issue, is it possible to look at a control study from the scene?
I don't know if it totally resolves it, but it does lend credence to the possibility that you have degradation occurring.
And what does that mean, using a control study?
If you are typing, or if you test another blood sample that's of a known source, or that you believe to be of a known source from the scene, and it shows a similar type of degradation that you have seen in the past and experienced, and that possibility exists in your sample, then I believe it's important to take that into consideration.
Now, is this idea of looking at a control study, such as a pool of blood underneath the victim, something that was reflected in science, in forensic science literature, that you considered prior to your testimony here?
Well, I had that opinion prior to this. However, I have read an article that enforces my opinion about that.
I had it right in my hand. Okay. Specifically, sir, did you look at an article by Bruce Berdoli and Robert Allen entitled Electrophoresis Reliability, the Contaminant Issue?
Yes, I did.
And direct your attention to page 1546.
Mr. Blazer, do you have that article?
Yeah.
We cited this in one of our papers, Your Honor. Sir, is this dealing with the EAP issue per se, or is this dealing more broadly with various contaminant issues in electrophoresis and problem resolving in electrophoresis?
It's dealing with electrophoresis reliability in general, not just with EAP.
Can you tell us, can you read for us the portion of the Berdoli article that suggests looking at a control study from the scene and trying to provide more information about what's happening at the scene? The portion that I have bracketed off.
Starts with, furthermore, the competent and experienced forensic scientist does not work in a vacuum. It should be stressed that the analyst gathers as much information as possible regarding the case, then in parentheses, and potential influence such as contaminants, close parentheses, to evaluate properly the data obtained from evidentiary material. More importantly, in reality, an ideal control study is naturally provided to forensic scientists. This is the electrophoretic analysis of victims' blood on victims' clothing and other substrata. The blood shed by a victim onto his or her own clothing and surrounding substrata is exposed to the same myriad of environmental insults as other questioned stains submitted to the laboratory for electrophoretic analysis. The accuracy of electrophoretic typing of the question sample can be independently verified with the victim's whole blood.
And sir, what was your interpretation of that in terms of using a control study to resolve issues as to what's happening in a crime scene?
Well, that confirmed a policy that we have had as far as collecting a known blood sample from the scene from each of the victims, and that information from that can be used to consider information derived from other samples.
And sir, is that why, in expressing certain opinions in court on direct examination regarding this EAP issue, you considered test results on the pool of blood underneath Nicole Brown, item 42?
Yes, that's correct.
Maybe we can see the serology results for it. Now, Mr. Matheson, when you considered those test results on 42, were those test results inconclusive?
Yes, they were.
And were you reporting those test results? Let me wait until we put the board up. Maybe it will make it a little easier. That's People's 202. Okay, directing your attention to the item that says 42, blood under Nicole Brown. Under the EAP column, it says inconclusive B, very weak. Is that correct?
Yes, it does.
And were you reporting this inconclusive result for the purposes of suggesting that it was correct? In other words, that the blood was in fact a type B blood?
Well, I did not report a type at all for that. My report reflects inconclusive.
I'm sorry, my terminology was wrong. When you were testifying about this result, were you testifying about it for the purposes of suggesting that the inconclusive B was a correct result in the sense that the blood really was a type B?
No, I was not.
So what was your purpose in considering this and testifying about this? in giving your explanations about the EAP results under the fingernails.
Okay, the inconclusive, like I mentioned, no activity would be you're not seeing anything on the gel. A result that's reported is a definitive result. It's what you are seeing occurring on that gel. A inconclusive falls somewhere in between. It's a pretty broad range. It could be just almost possible to call, but you're not quite sure there's something about it, or it could be something that's very vague, just kind of a blurry occurrence in there. In this case, I observed what I thought might be a B. It wasn't good enough to call. I am not going to say for a fact that it is a B, but it occurred in an area and on a sample that we are assuming to be from a particular person and thus of a particular type. We know her for a fact to be a type BA, and the fact that this is an inconclusive B shows that there's something going on with this blood and with the samples, and that the results should be interpreted carefully.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to mark 2 more exhibits, and they're similar to, in fact, just smaller versions of the ones that the defense marked. As people's next in order.
224.
And I marked them as 224A and 224B.
Yes.
And A is what appears to be a electrophoretic, and it has the numbers 1304.
And Mr. Blazier, you're familiar with both of these?
I am.
And 224B is 7310.
All right.
Now,
Two shows of Mr. Blazier real quick.
when you were talking about item number 42 just a few moments ago, what is the purpose of collecting that item again?
I think we've asked this a couple times.
Okay. So, sir, when you were saying that you were assuming that that is the victim's blood, that's based on what?
The location from where it was collected.
Okay. And is that why this type of sample is collected?
Yes.
Sir, I'd now like to show you people's 224A and 224B. Showing 224A first. What is that?
224A is a copy of a photograph of my electrophoresis run number 7309, which contains, among other items, the fingernail scrapings 84A and 84B.
Okay, and 224B is?
224B is another photograph of a photograph of electrophoresis run number 7310, which includes, among other things, the results of item number 42.
No. On 224B, for identification, I'd like to, perhaps if I could put it on the Elmo and then maybe pass it around, but I'd like the witness to us. Could you identify for us, just by writing on the bottom of the photograph, where 42 is?
It's in position 4, putting a arrow up from the bottom above the number 42.
Not 224B on the Elmo. we see the part of the photograph that has the writing on it? No, we need to see the white part, the bottom. Okay, so have you written in where 42 is?
Yes, I have.
And is one of the reasons that you considered this that logically a pool of the victim's blood should contain the victim's blood?
Yes.
So without testing it, would have you expected this to look like a BA?
Yes, I would have.
But when you tested it, what did it look like?
Well, gave a weak result that eventually ended up being called inconclusive, but I saw the two B bands very, very lightly, kind of fuzzy clouds in the areas where you'd expect to see them.
Maybe we can just, with directing the arrows, print out where those are.
Oh, okay, we need to go up. I move the arrow to the left, now to the right. It can go lay right on top of that other band. And that's pointing right into the lower B band. That's fine right there.
Okay, and let's put another arrow on the upper, pointing to the upper B band.
If you go directly above the arrow that was previously placed by two bands, go up, 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 down a little bit. Right about in there is the other B band.
I know it's hard to see on the Elmo, Mr. Matheson, but when you look at this plate, do you see any distinct band pattern in either of the two A regions?
For that item?
Yes.
No, I do not.
But do you see a band pattern in the two B regions?
I see something that has kind of a band-like appearance. It's not a good band. If it was, I'd have called it.
All right. Now, assuming this is in fact a BA, using the Raxel and Eames degradation route, if we assume that were the only degradation route, would you expect to see this?
No, I would not.
Why not?
Because if this is a fact, a BA, as you're assuming, then I would expect to still see that lower A band in addition to the two B bands.
Jack, this mischaracterizes this exhibit. I see a band there.
Overruled.
Now, Mr. Matheson, by the way, how many years do you have of experience in total looking at these banding patterns?
Approximately 12 years.
Okay. And you're saying that there are only two distinct, I'm sorry, they didn't say they were distinct, but there are only two band-like patterns that you see on this.
Objection, mischaracterized his testimony. He said it was not a band.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
There were only two patterns that you saw, is that correct?
In that lane, I am seeing what appears to be two very weak band-like appearances in those areas. This is a very weak sample, difficult to read.
Now, can we print this out? As People's 224.
C.
Now, before this permission, could we show this to the jury? Because the resolution on our Elmo isn't that great.
Yes.
And just before I show them to Mr. Matheson, so that we know what we're looking for, you wrote a 42 on the lane that represents 42. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Pointing up. And well, maybe we can also pass around the printout too, so that they can just compare.
May I see that, please?
Sure.
around. I have no objection to the photograph.
Well, I just think that might be helpful in identifying where to look.
I disagree.
All right, objections overruled.
Still waiting.
That's correct. One more to go.
Okay.
Your Honor, after the court's permission, I might be able to ask a couple questions.
Please do.
Just to, yeah, thank you.
I'd like to finish with Mr. Matheson today if we could.
Your Honor, I'd like to mark as people's next in order. 225, and I may also be marking the 224D later on, but as 225, a document that says electrophoresis worksheet.
And Mr. Blazer, you have a
And
copy of this?
contains 41, 42, it's L387.
All right.
Mr. Matheson, while we're waiting for the printout, can you just tell us what L387 is?
L387 is a photocopy that actually is slightly crooked, cuts off part of the left-hand column of one of my electrophoresis worksheets that corresponds with photo number 7310.
And on this particular worksheet, you called item number 84, the fingernails, as a B what?
This worksheet does not have 84 on it.
That doesn't have 84. Does that have 42 on it?
Yes, it does.
Sorry. And what was 42 called as?
A B question mark INC for inconclusive. The second reading on that was an NA for no activity.
I just want to perhaps put this on the Elmo just one more time, if I may, before I go to the jury. This is 224. I'm not going to mark it or make another printout.
We have to see it again?
I just want to make sure that everyone knows where we are.
I think the arrow there is apparent in the lane.
Now, sir, between in the arrow is pointing to an area that I guess on the photograph would be about a quarter to a half of an inch above it, that's sort of a bright band. And where is the band that we're looking for in relationship to that?
Well, it's in that same.
Characterizes testimony.
Sustained.
What?
Band.
Well, I'm referring to you see these very, very bright hash marks that go all the way across the bottom part of the photograph.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I do.
Okay. And there's one of those hash marks. There's an arrow that has number 42 and the arrow is pointing to one of the hash marks.
Yes.
Okay, where in relationship to that hash mark is the lane that constitutes 42?
42 is everything directly above the arrow. It's a lane about 3/8 of an inch wide, directly above the arrow.
Okay. Sure, hash marks probably wasn't the scientifically correct term, but
Mrs. Robertson?
No. Collect that from Deputy Long, please. All right, proceed.
Now, Mr. Matheson, I want to show you 224A for identification. And do you still have that? Does that have item number 42, item number 84 in it?
Yes, yes, it does.
And using the same pen, can you write arrows for 84A and 84B?
Okay, I'm writing an arrow, 2 arrows, down from the 2 columns that indicate 84A and 84B, and then marking 84A under one of the arrows and just B under the other one because of lack of space.
Sir, on that, are there any other results that you got that appear to contain a B-like pattern?
There are actually a couple others that I called B inconclusive, and I believe there is one. No, that's it.
Is there a 117 on there?
One of the lanes is the results of item 117.
Can you
yes.
just point that out for us with the arrow, in other words, and write 117?
Okay, I'm writing, again, an arrow pointing up into the lane that expresses the results or the data obtained from item number 117.
And was 117 identified as being one of the rear gate stains from the Bundy location?
Yes, I believe it was.
And you got a B-like pattern on that?
I called it a B question mark inconclusive, yes.
Now, Mr. Matheson, why do the lanes that contain 84A and B look so messy to a layperson?
Well, there are times in electrophoresis where when you're doing a run, there is something that blocks or hinders the electrical flow through it, through the gel from one side to another, and causes the bands not to migrate as evenly as they should.
Now, with respect to 84A and B, are there any hazy areas on this that do not, in your opinion, constitute a distinct band pattern?
Well, there's general haziness in a lot of the areas.
And maybe using the marker, you can identify some of the haziness for us that, in your opinion, does not constitute a distinct band pattern. In other words, an A-like band.
Well, in general, there is a haziness that shows up. We're talking about 84 A and B right now. That does show up or appear to exist between the two B bands. It's a general fluorescence or luminescence occurring there.
Of which one? Of 84A or 84B?
As I see it here, of both of them. There just appears to be a general lightening of that area.
Can you direct the arrow down to the location that you're referring to?
Okay, if you move the arrow to the left, farther, and down, right in there. In general, that's true on both items.
And you mean on the 84B one as well?
That's correct.
Can you direct the arrow to the area on the 84B side? Can you get the arrow to face?
There
Thank
we
you.
go.
Objection, you're relevant. Some foundation that this has any scientific meaning.
Oh, well. Move the arrow to the right and down a little bit. And in that general area there, you can just see there's a slight brightening of that area, not a band, but something's occurring in that area.
But in your view, does that have any forensic significance?
Well, it's not anything that I'd call even close to a band, so no.
Okay, and is that why it is helpful to have some experience in looking at these kinds of things as opposed to just being a lay person to try to distinguish between something that's there but doesn't have any significance and something that's there and does?
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Sir, does your experience as a serologist help you to distinguish between something that appears that does not have significance when looking at EAP as opposed to something that does?
Yes, it does.
And how so?
It's just after having seen many of these samples, you get the experience on how to read them.
And in your opinion, these highlighted areas, not highlighted, but the areas with the arrows pointing to them, you would not conclude are A bands, is that correct?
I don't see what I feel are bands in that area.
All right. Now, directing your attention to 117, how many bands on 84A do you see?
We're talking about 84A now, right?
84A.
I see what appears to be two bands.
Can we use a different color arrow to demarcate those two bands?
Okay, move it down, please. That's one of the bands there. It's kind of curved, but that's the band. Down further. Down, down, down. Right about there is roughly the middle left side of that band as it curves down.
And can you now mark for us using also green arrows, but facing the other way, the bands that you see on 84B?
Move it down. Over to the left a little bit. There, a little bit further. Right there. That's the one of the bands. And down further. Down, down. Go to the left. And right down inside of that mush is another. I'll move it up just a little bit. There. That's the location of the other band.
And now let's turn our attention to 117, if we can just keep this all and then print it out later to get it all in one shot. Just for the record, Mr. Matheson, there are two yellow arrows. Do those yellow arrows signify what you are saying are the B bands in the 84A lane?
Yes.
And the red arrow signifies some haze that you consider to be insignificant.
That I don't consider to be a band, that's correct.
With respect to the 84B lane, the green arrows signify the B bands in that lane,
Yes,
and the blue arrow signifies what?
the hazy area in between it,
That you do not attribute forensic significance to.
that I'm not seeing a band, that's correct.
Now, turning our attention to 117.
This is part of the control study.
Overruled.
Turning your attention to 117, does that also had a B-like pattern according to your testimony? Is that correct?
I called it a B inconclusive.
Right.
Both bands are present.
Objection outside the scope of direct. On 117. Never mentioned.
Sustained.
Mr. Matheson, in your experience in other cases, have you seen instances where a known BA sample had degraded in such a way as to appear to be a B with both B bands present?
I believe I have, yes.
And have you seen situations like that occurring, in your opinion, at this particular crime scene?
Yes, I believe I have.
Only in the pool of blood 42? Or elsewhere at the crime scene?
Taking into account other information elsewhere.
And is 117 one of the other locations where you believe that you've seen a B-like pattern?
Objection beyond scope.
Sustained.
Well, sir, in your opinion, is your opinion as to the fingernail scrapings that you've offered both on direct and cross, take into account anything else at the crime scene other than the items that you testified to specifically on direct and cross-examination?
Objection beyond scope.
Well, you can answer that question.
There is one other sample that I did take into consideration, not necessarily to make the call of the B, but to reinforce my feeling that it may have at one time been a BA and that this phenomenon does in fact exist.
And which one was that?
Item number 117.
Okay, now with respect to,
Objection beyond scope. Move to strike.
Sustained.
all
We're not going to
testi-
go into 117.
okay, thank you, Your Honor.
Let's move.
Can we print out a copy of this document?
Objection beyond the scope. I object to anything with 117 on it.
Overruled. Jury is instructed on this exhibit to just disregard the 117 lane, but rather than go back and remark the whole thing, let's print it out. All right, let's proceed.
Thank you.
I think we can slice that part off. Okay.
Maybe I can proceed with a few more questions and wrap up the EAP issue, and then I'd like to show these, the photograph and the printout to the jury. The photo I'd like to mark as 224, I mean the printout is 224D.
I would request that the printout be cut off on the end rather than scribbled on.
We'll do that.
And with respect to item 85, I'm not going to, we won't show the electrophoresis plate on that. I'm not sure that it's worth the time, but on 85A and B, on our board, you said that the EAP type was inconclusive BA.
That's how it's on the board, yes.
And with respect to the A bands on that sample, what did you see?
that they were weaker than I would expect for a expected BA result.
And was what you were seeing consistent with the Raxel and Eames article in terms of the degradation path for the laboratory stains in that article?
Objection beyond the scope of direct.
Overruled.
What I was seeing, assuming that was degradation, did not appear to be consistent with that route,
Why?
because the two B bands were quite bright and the two A bands were fairly weak.
Now, Mr. Matheson, with respect to this issue of EAP, what steps did you take in order to try to resolve it further after this testing was performed?
I recommended that those items be submitted for DNA testing.
Okay. And it was suggested that when these came back from the Department of Justice, it was for the purposes of EAP testing. Is that true?
That's something that was mentioned on cross, yes.
But I mean, is it true that that's the purpose for which they were returned to your laboratory?
No, like I testified, they were just returning to become a part of the rest of the case. It's our evidence.
What was everything from DOJ that was sent to them eventually returned to your laboratory?
Most everything. At this point, I'm not sure if we have absolutely everything back in our laboratory.
And why not do another EAP test?
At this point, I didn't feel it was necessary.
Well, why would you decide to submit it for DNA testing but not perform another EAP test?
Well, initially, I didn't want to use up any more sample to run additional tests.
And would an additional EAP test provide you with more information?
I would expect it to give me the same result as it did the first time.
Would a genetic test, well, why would you expect it to give you the same results as it did the first time?
Because the result is what I obtained from the sample. If I run it once or 100 times, I would expect to see the same thing from that sample.
So it doesn't get undegraded just because you run it another time?
Assuming it was degraded, yes, it would not just go undegraded.
Is there a way, by the way, according to the scientific literature, to undegrade a sample, to bring out a degraded band?
Depends on what we're calling degraded. There are some situations where you get a type of degradation, you add what's called a reducing agent to it, and it can correct some of the problems.
Or is there anything that could be done in this, I don't know if this is a correct term, to undegrade bands, if there are A bands in our samples here, 84A and B?
Not to my knowledge, no.
And you've testified that, generally speaking, when you're doing these tests, you try to conserve sample for future testing. Is that correct?
All types of tests, yes.
And is that so that it will be available for anyone, either the defense or prosecution, that wants to do more testing on an item?
Yes, you try and not use any more sample than necessary.
Did you want to conserve any remaining sample from 85A and 85B rather than using it on another EAP test?
Isn't this sort of like the same question turned about the fifth way around?
I don't know.
I think so.
Okay, thank you.
The jury loved the undegraded question.
I'd like to.
We need to edit the 117 article.
Does the court have any scissors?
You want to hand those two items to juror number one, please? We'll take a break at 2:30. See counsel without the court.